August in East Prussia, 1914. The war was exactly 3 weeks old, and a Russian general named Alexander Samsonov was riding on horseback through the Masurian forest at night, in the rain, unable to communicate with his corps commanders, unable to reach his rear headquarters, unable to stop what had already been set in motion around him. His Second Army, 206,000 men who had crossed into German territory 2 weeks earlier as the opening thrust of Russia's war, was collapsing inward from 3 sides simultaneously. He could hear the German artillery cutting off his last viable escape routes. He dismounted at some point in the darkness of the night of the 29th of August, walked a short distance into the trees, and shot himself. The German 8th Army had encircled and effectively destroyed the Russian Second Army in 5 days. 92,000 Russians were taken prisoner. 30,000 were killed or wounded. 500 artillery pieces were seized, requiring 60 separate railway trains to haul the captured equipment back into Germany. And the German forces that achieved it had done so, and this is the part that still sits strangely when you turn it over, while outnumbered, while facing a 2-army invasion from the east, and partly by reading their enemy's own mail. The reason this battle matters as more than just a spectacular early war German victory is that almost nothing that followed on the Eastern Front, or in German domestic politics, or in the eventual shape of the Weimar Republic's collapse, can be fully understood without it. Tannenberg produced Hindenburg, and Hindenburg, 2 decades later, handed Germany to someone far worse than himself. But before any of that, before the myths, before the propaganda, before the political wreckage, there was the operational question of how a smaller German force managed to encircle a larger Russian one in 5 days, on a 60-mile front, in terrain neither side had prepared adequately for, in a war that everyone still expected would be decided by Christmas. That question is what this video is really about. The Russian invasion of East Prussia in August 1914 was not a desperate improvisation. It was something close to the opposite, a deliberate, treaty-mandated acceleration of Russia's mobilization timetable, executed specifically to pull German forces away from France, while the Schlieffen Plan was still in motion. Russia had promised France it would put 800,000 men into the field within 15 days of war's declaration. The Russian First Army, under General Rennenkampf, crossed the German border from the east on the 17th of August. Samsonov's Second Army swung up from the south. The plan was for the 2 armies to converge around the German 8th Army like a closing set of jaws, cutting it off and destroying it before it could be reinforced from the west. On paper, with the 2 armies' combined strength running to over 400,000 men, against a German force of roughly 210,000, the logic was sound. What the plan could not account for, what no planning document can ever fully account for, was the specific human beings who would be holding it together in the field. Rennenkampf and Samsonov despised each other. The animosity between them was not professional disagreement. It was personal, documented, and deep enough that some accounts place a physical altercation between the 2 men on a railway platform during the Russo-Japanese War a decade earlier. When the invasion began, their armies were supposed to be coordinating, sharing intelligence, timing their movements to converge precisely enough to trap the Germans between them. What actually happened was that Rennenkampf's First Army, after winning the Battle of Gumbinnen on the 20th of August and driving the German 8th Army back, simply stopped advancing. He halted and resupplied while Samsonov's Second Army continued its southward sweep into German-held territory alone, increasingly isolated, increasingly exposed on its flanks, with no First Army movement on the horizon to close the trap it was supposed to be half of. What the Germans were doing during this pause is the part of Tannenberg that military historians and intelligence analysts have been studying ever since. Colonel Max Hoffmann, the German operations chief who understood the Russian situation more clearly than almost anyone else in the German command, had been intercepting Russian wireless transmissions since the opening days of the campaign. The Russians were broadcasting their core-level orders in plain text, unencrypted. The confusion over coded cipher books had left Russian commanders defaulting to open transmission, which meant that Hoffman was reading Samsonov's operational orders with the same ease and speed as Samsonov's own subordinates. He knew the Second Army's positions. He knew its marching routes. He knew it was advancing without flank protection. And he knew, because he was reading Rennenkampf's transmissions too, that the First Army had no immediate plans to move south and cover Samsonov's exposed right flank. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, recalled from retirement and rushed east to take command of the German 8th Army on the 23rd of August, arrived to find Hoffman had already drafted the outlines of the solution. Pull the German forces facing Rennenkampf's stalled First Army away from the north. Leave a thin screen. Rail the released divisions south and west around Samsonov's flanks, close behind him. Seal the exits. The German rail network inside East Prussia, built with exactly this kind of rapid internal redeployment in mind, could move whole corps laterally faster than Russian infantry could march. It was not just faster, it was an entirely different category of speed, the way a car outpaces a man, not by going slightly faster, but by operating in a different dimension of movement altogether. The encirclement closed between the 26th and the 29th of August. Corps commanders inside the Russian Second Army began losing contact with each other. Then with Samsonov's headquarters. Then units stopped receiving orders entirely and began trying to break out independently, in multiple directions, through forests that had already been occupied by German flanking columns. One Russian corps, the 13th, was almost completely destroyed attempting to escape through a closing gap. Another, the 15th, dissolved into fragments. When Samsonov walked into the forest on the night of the 29th, he knew what the numbers already showed. 2.5 Russian corps had been annihilated. The remaining half of his Second Army was severely fractured. And the German 8th Army, which had been predicted by some Russian planners to have retreated entirely behind the Vistula River by this point, had not retreated an inch. What happened next, in Germany, in Russia, in the reputations of the men involved, is the part this video hasn't opened yet. What Tannenberg did to Hindenburg's career, what it did to Samsonov's memory, and to how Russia processed a defeat this complete this early. How the German army used the Tannenberg victory to construct a political mythology that would outlive the war by 2 decades and corrode German democracy in ways nobody standing in that forest in August 1914 could possibly have predicted. There are threads here that run all the way to 1933, and they are worth following. If you are already at the edge of sleep, if the details are blurring a little at the edges, and the room is doing that thing where it gets softer and heavier, just stay wherever you are. The story will find you. Tannenberg is the kind of battle that works on you slowly, the way a forest works on you when you walk through it long enough to stop thinking about where the path is. Let it run. This is the entire history of the Battle of Tannenberg. There is a document held in the French diplomatic archive at the Quai d'Orsay, a document that most people have never heard of, that most military histories of the First World War mention only in passing. And it is, I would argue, the true starting point of the catastrophe we are about to examine. Not the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo in 1914, not the August mobilization orders, not the railway timetables. This document, a convention signed on the 17th of August 1892 between the French Republic and the Russian Empire. 33 pages, translated into 2 languages, signed in a room that smelled, probably, of tobacco and anxiety. The Franco-Russian Military Convention of 1892 is a treaty about timing. That's what it reduces to when you strip away the diplomatic language. France wanted Russia to promise that if Germany ever attacked westward, the Russian army would immediately mobilize and engage German forces on the eastern border. The word immediately appears in the draft. It was underlined. And then, in the final ratified text, the underline was removed. Someone took it out. We don't know who. We don't know whether it was a Russian negotiator protecting flexibility, or a French scribe making a careless omission, or something more deliberate. But that missing underline, that single editorial decision made sometime between draft and signature, became the clause that France spent the next 22 years trying to reinsert, diplomatically, financially, and ultimately in blood. The key figure in this story of contractual pressure isn't a general. It's Maurice Paléologue, France's ambassador to St. Petersburg in 1914. His published diary, released in 1921, is one of the most cited documents in early First World War diplomatic history. On the 4th of August, 1914, he visited both the Tsar and the Grand Duke Nicholas, Russia's supreme commander. He asked the Grand Duke directly, when would the offensive begin? The Grand Duke, who was 6 feet and 6 inches tall and had a reputation for competence rather than brilliance, replied, "It will probably be the 14th of August." That date wasn't a military calculation. It was a promise that had to be kept because Paléologue had been sent specifically to collect it. The Russian army would attack Germany's eastern flank in 15 days. France needed time to survive the initial German onslaught in the west. The alliance required it. What Paléologue's diary presents as a smooth, mutually agreeable exchange is complicated, significantly, by Russian Foreign Ministry internal telegrams from the same week. Those documents, held in the Russian State Historical Archive, describe the meeting rather differently. Where Paléologue records agreement, the Russian telegrams record tension. They describe the Tsar expressing grave reservations about the mobilization timetable. He knew, and his generals knew, that 15 days was not enough time to fully prepare the armies that would be committed. But the treaty obligation was real, and Russia's dependence on French loans and French investment in its railway network made refusal politically unthinkable. What Paléologue published in 1921 reads, in the light of those internal telegrams, less like a diplomatic diary and more like an alibi. He was constructing, in real time, a narrative of Russian eagerness that would insulate France from any later accusation that it had pressured an unprepared partner into a catastrophe it couldn't survive. France had, to its credit, invested heavily in trying to make the Russian promise achievable. Between roughly 1909 and 1913, France poured the equivalent of approximately 500 million gold francs into Russian railway construction. Specifically, the lines designed to accelerate military mobilization to the German border. The investment was strategic. It was deliberate. It bought something real. The Russian railway network was measurably faster in 1914 than it had been in 1905. But it bought speed on the main trunk lines, the north-south arteries connecting Moscow and St. Petersburg to the western frontier. It bought nothing on the other side of the border. Once Russian soldiers crossed into German East Prussia, there were no Russian gauge railways. There were sand roads. There were pine forests. There were horse-drawn wagons that sank to their axles, and a supply system that began starving within days. The Russian mobilization in July 1914 included a detail that has received far less attention than it deserves. Russia's mobilization didn't begin on the 30th of July, when Tsar Nicholas issued his public proclamation. It began, secretly, on the 25th of July, 5 days earlier. The covert head start was ordered precisely to buy time toward the French-mandated 15-day readiness timeline. German intercept records document this. The German intelligence service was tracking Russian mobilization before the Russians publicly admitted it was happening. Both sides, in other words, began the East Prussian campaign under conditions of deliberate misrepresentation about timing. Russia concealing its early mobilization, France concealing its role in engineering the timeline. The men who would die in the forests near Allenstein in late August didn't design any of this. They were the instruments of a contract. The geography of that contract's consequences is worth understanding precisely. Russia's two armies designated for the East Prussian campaign, General Rennenkampf's First Army in the north and General Samsonov's Second Army in the south, were separated by a significant terrain obstacle called the Masurian Lakes. A chain of glacial lakes, marshes, and forested ridges running roughly east to west through central East Prussia. The two armies couldn't directly support each other across this barrier without a wide detour, so the plan called for them to advance on either side, Rennenkampf striking westward north of the lakes toward Königsberg, Samsonov swinging up from the south below the lakes toward the Vistula, creating a double envelopment that would trap whatever German forces lay between them. It was, on paper, Hannibal's Cannae transposed onto a modern map. It required precise coordination. It required functional communication. It required that neither army outrun its supplies or its orders. None of these conditions would be met. Samsonov's Second Army crossed the German frontier on the 21st of August. By that point, they'd been marching for 9 days through a landscape that offered almost nothing to forage. Sandy tracks through pine scrub, occasional poor farms, mostly abandoned. The men were already rationing bread. Many units had no field bakeries. The mobilization had been too fast to include them. Every day the army marched, it consumed more of its operational reserves than it could replace. The artillery that was supposed to provide firepower had been assigned horses that needed 10 kilograms of fodder per day, and those horses were pulling guns through sand that halved their effective pulling strength. The genius of the Franco-Russian Treaty's mobilization clause was that it got men across the border. It had nothing to say about what happened to them after they got there. What I find most striking, reading back through this period, is how completely the disaster was structurally prefigured before a single shot was fired. The French investment in Russian railways had addressed one bottleneck, speed to the border, while leaving the other bottleneck, everything east of the border, entirely unaddressed. Russian mobilization planners knew this. They accepted it as a calculated risk. The assumption was that speed of advance into Germany and the operational shock of a massive Russian presence in East Prussia would compensate for logistical fragility. That assumption required a German enemy that would be slow, surprised, and unable to maneuver rapidly. The German 8th Army in East Prussia was none of those things. So when we talk about Tannenberg, when we trace what happened in those 5 days between the 26th and 30th of August 1914, we need to hold this background in mind. The men who marched into the trap were not stupid. Their general was not a fool. As we'll see, he argued repeatedly against the conditions he was placed in. The disaster was not primarily the result of errors made in August 1914. It was the result of a contract signed in August 1892, a missing underline, a French ambassador who wrote his alibi in real time, and a railway network that stopped at the border. The steamroller, what Russia actually had. Let me tell you what an army looks like on paper. The Russian Second Army, as constituted on the 21st of August 1914, comprised 5 infantry corps, 4 cavalry divisions, and supporting arms totaling somewhere between 123,000 and 180,000 men, depending on which set of records you consult. And that discrepancy alone should tell you something about the administrative precision with which this force was assembled. On paper, it was formidable. 612 artillery pieces, 384 machine guns, 5 corps commanders, a cavalry screen that should have been probing a 60-mile front, reporting enemy movements and securing the flanks. On paper, The Second Army was everything the German Eighth Army, 150,000 men, 294 machine guns, 728 guns, should have feared. The 5 corps that made up Samsonov's force had specific identities and specific commanders. On the Russian left flank, General Artemonov's 1st Corps. Moving through the center, General Kluyev's 13th Corps and General Martos's 15th Corps. The 2 units Samsonov would retain closest to his own headquarters as communication collapsed. On the right flank, General Blagoveshchensky's 6th Corps, and between these 4, the 23rd Corps under Kondratovich, which was understrength and incompletely equipped even before the campaign began. These weren't conscripts without training. They were men of the Imperial Russian Army, which had spent the decades since the Russo-Japanese War attempting, with partial success, to modernize itself. The 15th Corps, in particular, had a reputation for solid infantry performance, and the Russian field gun, the 76.2mm Model 1902, the so-called 3-inch gun, was by any honest technical assessment one of the better field artillery pieces in service anywhere in Europe in 1914. It could fire 10 to 12 rounds per minute at a maximum range of 8.5 kilometers. At Gumbinnen, on the 20th of August, Russian artillerists used it to shatter a German corps. The gun was not the problem. German aerial intelligence was watching all of this with understandable concern. The Taube monoplanes of German Feldfliegerabteilung 16 conducted observation flights over the advancing Russian columns, beginning approximately the 22nd of August. Their reports described heavy columns, artillery, infantry, cavalry, supply trains, spreading across a front of roughly 60 miles south of the Masurian Lakes. Those reports reached 8th Army headquarters and produced a specific, documented moment of alarm. An intelligence summary from approximately the 18th of August, held in what is now the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, carries a handwritten marginal annotation. Samsonov's army is stronger than we anticipated. Air reconnaissance confirms heavy artillery components. That note matters. It tells us the Germans weren't cavalier about what they were facing. They were genuinely worried. What the note cannot tell us, what the aerial reconnaissance fundamentally couldn't reveal, was that those heavy artillery pieces were 60 kilometers behind their crews, mired in sand and functionally useless. Now, the cavalry logistics problem. This is the kind of calculation that never appears in popular accounts of the battle, but that explains, more concretely than almost anything else, why the Second Army's operational capacity collapsed so quickly. Samsonov had approximately 4 cavalry divisions in his force, the units theoretically responsible for screening his flanks, detecting German movements, and reporting back. Each cavalry division required significant daily fodder and water for its horses. Working from standard Russian cavalry field tables, the Second Army's combined cavalry and transport horse complement, roughly 20,000 animals, needed on the order of 200 metric tons of fodder per day. That figure is not an abstraction. 200 tons of hay and grain delivered daily by horse-drawn wagons, along sand tracks, from railheads 50 or more kilometers behind the front, using the same horse-drawn transport that is itself consuming part of the fodder it's supposed to deliver. The cavalry that was supposed to be probing Samsonov's flanks spent most of its operational energy feeding itself. The communications disaster was arguably worse, and it was both structural and administrative. Structural because Russian field cable supplies were genuinely insufficient. Each signals company carried roughly 30 kilometers of insulated field telephone wire, enough to cover a corps-level frontage but nothing beyond. Once the Second Army crossed the German border and began advancing, the cable ran out within 2 days. The alternative was wireless telegraph. And here the administrative failure arrives. The Russian Northwestern Front, General Zhilinsky's command, had issued codebooks to two of the three army commanders operating under it. Rennenkampf had one. Zhilinsky himself had one. Samsonov had none. A spare codebook had simply not been delivered before the campaign began. Russian General Staff records confirm this. It was not an emergency improvisation. It was a known deficiency, accepted as a calculated risk by Northwestern Front headquarters before the campaign began. The calculation, apparently, was that speed of advance would compensate for communication insecurity. The Germans had broken the old Russian cipher system anyway. A new one existed. There weren't enough copies. What this meant in practice was that every radio message Samsonov needed to send to Zhilinsky, to his corps commanders, to Rennenkampf, had to go out in plain text. Unencrypted Morse code, broadcast on medium wave frequencies between roughly 300 and 600 kilohertz, receivable at distances of 150 to 300 kilometers under normal atmospheric conditions. German intercept stations at Thorn, Königsberg, and field positions throughout East Prussia were all within that reception radius. And the Germans, unlike the Russians, had an unusually high concentration of Russian-language officers in the 8th Army, men from Baltic German aristocratic families who had spent years in proximity to the Russian imperial world and could read Cyrillic text and translate Russian military terminology without difficulty. Samsonov's operational orders were being read by his enemy essentially as fast as they were being received by his own subordinates. There is a specific detail about Russian artillery performance that I keep returning to when I think about this campaign, because it captures the particular cruelty of the Second Army's situation. The Russian 76.2mm gun was excellent. At Gumbinnen on the 20th of August, Russian batteries fired at nearly 440 rounds per gun per day, nearly double the approved daily rate, and the results were decisive. German formations broke. Mackensen's 17th Corps routed. The gun worked. But sustaining that rate of fire for even a second day of pursuit would have required approximately 70,000 additional artillery rounds delivered to forward positions within 18 hours. The Russian supply system had absolutely no mechanism to achieve this. The victory at Gumbinnen, spectacular and real, was logistically unrepeatable. The Russian army had, in a single afternoon of intense fire, spent the ammunition that might have won a second battle, a pursuit, a campaign. After Gumbinnen, the guns went quiet not from defeat, but from exhaustion. The exhaustion of a system that had been designed to advance faster than its supply chain could follow. The German 8th Army that faced this force was numerically smaller. 150,000 men against somewhere between 123,000 and 180,000 Russians, a number that itself tells a story of administrative chaos. But the Germans were concentrated, supplied, and operating on a railway network they had built specifically for this kind of lateral, rapid movement between threats. Every ton of German supplies moved on standard gauge rail at 30 to 40 kilometers per hour to within a few kilometers of the front. Every ton of Russian supplies moved by horse-drawn wagon at 3 to 4 kilometers per hour from railheads that were sometimes 50 kilometers back. The operational tempo gap between these two forces wasn't 2 to 1. It was closer to 15 to 1. What I want the listener to understand, before we move into the battle itself, is that what happened to Samsonov's army wasn't a mystery solved only in hindsight. The mathematics of its collapse were visible in the logistics data before the campaign began. 200 metric tons of daily fodder through sand roads, a wireless station with no codebook, artillery without its ammunition, a railway gauge that stopped at the border. These weren't strategic surprises. They were known constraints that Russian military planning had accepted as tolerable. They weren't tolerable, and the German 8th Army, once it had commanders willing to exploit the intelligence these constraints created, was positioned to prove it, rapidly and completely. The The German advantage in this opening phase wasn't genius, it was infrastructure. The genius came later, and even then, as we'll see, it was more complicated than the legend suggests. The old man in retirement, Hindenburg, gets the call. On the morning of the 22nd of August, 1914, Paul von Hindenburg was living the life of a retired general in Hanover. He was 66 years old. He had left active service in 1911, and by the summer of 1914, he was spending his days as retired Prussian generals did, walking, reading, receiving visitors, watching from a comfortable remove as the war he'd spent his career preparing for arrived without him. He had no staff, no aide-de-camp, no staff car. He kept a study and, presumably, a garden. He had been, to all institutional appearances, finished. The telegram that arrived that morning was from German Supreme Headquarters, the Oberste Heeresleitung, the OHL. It offered him command of the 8th Army in East Prussia, where the situation had, in the space of 48 hours, become alarming. Would he take it? His reply was 4 words. In German, Ich bin bereit. I am ready. The original telegram and its reply are held in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. They are among the most consequential 4-word exchanges in German political history, which is saying something for a nation not short of consequential exchanges. He packed a single bag. He arranged transport. He got on a train. The man chosen as his chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff, was coming from the Western Front, where he had recently distinguished himself at Liège. Younger, more aggressive, technically brilliant in ways that Hindenburg, a territorial expert, a man of composure and authority rather than operational creativity, was not. They met for the first time on the station platform at Hanover, in the small hours of the night of the 22nd to 23rd of August. They boarded a special train together and travelled east through the night, toward a headquarters they had never visited, an army they had never commanded, and a battle whose plan, as it would turn out, had already been largely drafted by someone else. Both men's memoirs describe this first meeting. Both describe it differently. The emotional warmth of Hindenburg's account, 2 old soldiers finding immediate mutual respect, sits somewhat uneasily against Ludendorff's rather more businesslike version. Make of that what you will. The man who had actually been thinking through the problem was Colonel Max Hoffmann, the 8th Army's chief of operations. Hoffmann was 45 years old, Prussian, technically formidable, personally abrasive, and possessed of the specific quality that military operations most require: the ability to look at a chaotic situation and identify the one thing that matters most. He had served as a German military observer during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, and had come away from that experience with a detailed understanding of the Russian officer corps, its culture, its command habits, its specific vulnerabilities. He knew, from observation, that the 2 Russian armies threatening East Prussia were separated by difficult terrain. He knew, from intercepts, that they were not coordinating. He had concluded, before Hindenburg and Ludendorff's train arrived, that the correct response to the East Prussian crisis was not retreat to the Vistula, as the panicking General Prittwitz had proposed, but a rapid lateral redeployment by rail to concentrate the German force against Samsonov's Second Army, while leaving only a cavalry screen facing Rennenkampf in the north. Destroy one, then turn and deal with the other. Hoffmann's diary records the arrival of the new commanders at Marienburg on the afternoon of the 23rd of August. They were met by the 8th Army staff, briefed on the situation, and shown the operational plan already in motion. Hindenburg, by Hoffmann's account, said very little. Ludendorff issued 3 rapid decisions. Hoffmann watched both men with what his diary describes as careful interest. The new commanders approved the plan. The subsequent German military memoir literature, particularly Hindenburg's 1920 book and Ludendorff's own account, presents this moment as one of decisive leadership arriving in the nick of time, the new commanders grasping the situation and shaping the response. A 1929 German General Staff internal study, marked for internal use only, found by the historian Dennis Showalter in the Bundesarchiv decades later, reaches a rather different conclusion. It states, in the careful language of institutional self-assessment, that the operational plan for the battle was substantially complete before the arrival of the new army commander and his chief of staff. This document was not published. It was not cited by Hindenburg or Ludendorff. It sat in a filing cabinet for 6 decades. None of this diminishes the genuine contribution of Hindenburg and Ludendorff. What it does is locate that contribution more precisely. Hindenburg provided something the German officer corps in August 1914 desperately needed: a commander of sufficient seniority, composure, and institutional authority that frightened corps commanders would obey him. Divisional generals wouldn't freelance beyond the plan, and the Kaiser's headquarters wouldn't second-guess every operational decision. He was the weight at the top of the machine. Without that weight, the machine might have shaken itself apart. Ludendorff provided the nerve, the willingness to accept operational risk, to hold the flanks thin against Rennenkampf while concentrating against Samsonov, to keep the plan moving even when the anxious hours came. Both qualities were real, both mattered, but the specific operational architecture, the lateral rail movement, the encirclement template, the calculated gamble on Rennenkampf's passivity, that came from Hoffmann. There's a detail about Hindenburg's background that almost never appears in popular accounts of the battle, and that changes, slightly but meaningfully, how we understand what followed. Hindenburg had participated in German military exercises in East Prussia in 1894. Exercises that included, as their central tactical problem, the simulated encirclement of an enemy force advancing from the south. He had wargamed, 20 years before it happened, something very close to the Battle of Tannenberg. Those exercises are documented in German army training records. His knowledge of the terrain wasn't just theoretical. He'd walked those roads, mapped those forest edges, calculated those march times. When Hoffmann showed him the plan on the 23rd of August, he wasn't seeing it for the first time as a concept. He was recognizing it as a landscape. The railway move that made everything possible began before Hindenburg and Ludendorff had formally taken command. The 8th Army's 1st Corps, which had been operating north of the lakes against Rennenkampf, was already being loaded onto trains by the 22nd of August. One train every 30 minutes. The head of the 8th Army's field railways was a man named Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Groner, and the logistical challenge he was now managing, moving a full army corps by rail across 150 kilometers of East Prussian countryside in 72 hours, deserves a chapter of its own. It will get one. What I want to stay with for a moment, before we move on, is the image of Hindenburg on that train from Hanover. A retired general, 66 years old, packing a single bag, traveling through the German night toward a battle that would make him the most famous soldier in his country. The legend that grew from what followed, the postcards, the nail statues, the presidential campaign, the appointment of a certain Austrian chancellor in 1933. None of it was visible in that train carriage. All that was visible was an old man who said he was ready, and a plan that someone else had already drawn. Gumbinnen, the battle that should have changed everything. Russia won a battle on the 20th of August, 1914. This is not a disputed fact. It is not a matter of interpretive emphasis or historiographical nuance. On the 20th of August, the Russian First Army under General Paul von Rennenkampf engaged the German 8th Army at Gumbinnen, roughly 25 miles from the East Prussian frontier. and by the end of that day, the Germans were retreating. In the center and on the right, German formations, including August von Mackensen's 17th Corps, had broken. Not withdrawn in good order, broken, thrown rifles and ran. Staff officers in motorcars blocked roads and were ignored. Mackensen himself drove along the retreat route, urging his men back, and couldn't stop them. The stampede covered 15 miles before it exhausted itself. Russia won at Gumbinnen. The question this chapter asks is, why did a Russian victory lead, within 10 days, to the complete destruction of a Russian army? The opening hours of Gumbinnen were Hermann von Francois' doing, for good and ill. Francois commanded the German First Corps on the German left flank, and he was constitutionally incapable of following orders he disagreed with. He launched his attack before Mackensen's 17th Corps and Below's 1st Reserve Corps were in position to support him, because he was ready, and he didn't see why readiness should be constrained by the readiness of others. His attack on the Russian right flank at around 4 in the morning caught a Russian formation unprepared and inflicted serious damage. 3,000 Russian prisoners taken. The Russian 27th Division badly mauled. Francois watched from a church steeple, as he would later do at other critical moments, directing fire with the calm of a man who believed he was always right. On this occasion, he largely was. But his jumpstart alerted the Russian center before Mackensen's force was engaged, and the Russian artillery was ready when the 17th Corps finally came up. What happened next to Mackensen's corps is one of the most vivid artillery actions of the entire First World War's opening month. Russian batteries opened fire with what the after-action reports describe as devastating effect. The German infantry, advancing in parade ground formations that the pre-war German training manuals still, inexplicably, specified, were caught in open ground under sustained shell fire. The Russian guns on this day fired at rates far exceeding normal doctrine. Nearly 440 rounds per battery, nearly double the approved allocation. The Russian gunners burned through their ammunition with the recklessness of people who believed they were on the winning side of history. They were right on that day. Mackensen's corps broke. The image that German officers recorded in their accounts is one of spontaneous collapse, a company running, triggering the company beside it, spreading like fire through dry grass across brigade and divisional frontages until whole regiments were streaming westward, and the roads were blocked with men who had discarded equipment they no longer wanted to carry. Russian infantry held its positions against the pressure. The peasant soldier of the Imperial Russian Army, consistently underestimated by German and Western European analysis, was a tenacious, close-range fighter, stubborn in defense, willing to absorb punishment that would have collapsed more sophisticated formations. By nightfall on the 20th of August, the balance was clear. The German right and center had been broken. German forces overall were retreating. And Rennenkampf, standing at the head of a victorious army, did nothing to follow. His decision to halt is the great enigma of the campaign, and I want to be careful not to resolve it more neatly than the evidence permits. The supply situation was real. The First Army's logistics were strained. The supply wagons were behind schedule, and a rapid pursuit might have stretched an already thin chain to breaking. Francois' First Corps, which had performed well on the German left and hadn't broken, was somewhere to the north of the Russian advance route and could potentially have hit a pursuing Russian force in the flank. Rennenkampf didn't want to chase blindly. These were rational considerations. The standard German account, popularized by Max Hoffmann and repeated in virtually every Anglophone history of the battle, adds a more dramatic explanation. That Rennenkampf and Samsonov hated each other personally, that their mutual contempt dated from a physical confrontation on a railway platform during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, and that this personal hatred meant Rennenkampf simply had no intention of marching to his rival's aid. It's a compelling story. It's also almost certainly false. A scholarly examination of the source, the platform brawl story appears in Hoffman's post-war memoir, and nowhere in any contemporaneous Russian, Japanese, or German record, reveals that Hoffman told it only after the war, in a context where he had every professional incentive to present himself as the man whose psychological insight had decided the campaign. The story is too useful to be credible. What the supply records support is a simpler and less satisfying explanation. Rennenkamp stopped because stopping felt safer than moving, because his supply chain was fraying, and because nobody, not Jelinsky, not Grand Duke Nicholas, not any superior authority, ordered him to pursue vigorously. The Russian command system had no mechanism to translate tactical success into operational exploitation. There was no exploitation doctrine, no reserve force positioned to pour through a broken enemy's rear, no prearranged signal that would trigger a pursuit. The victory at Gumbinnen was real. The organizational machinery to convert it into a campaign result simply didn't exist. At 8th Army headquarters, meanwhile, General von Prittwitz received the news of Mackensen's rout and lost his composure entirely. He telephoned Moltke at German Supreme Headquarters that afternoon. He'd called at noon to say all was going well, and now called again with what the records describe as frantic and confused reporting. The Germans were going to retreat to the Vistula River, 200 kilometers to the west. This would hand all of East Prussia to the Russian army. East Prussia, historic heartland of the Prussian state, the agricultural base of the Junker class, the homeland of the men currently fighting in the First Corps. The proposal was militarily defensible in extremis and politically unthinkable in practice. Moltke was appalled. His choice, rapidly made, was to relieve Prittwitz of command. The new appointments, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, were notified by the morning of the 22nd of August. What's often missed in this sequence is that Prittwitz's instinct, however panicked in expression, wasn't entirely irrational. He had just watched a corps rout. He knew Samsonov's 5-corps army was crossing his southern flank. 2 Russian armies together did outnumber his force significantly. His error wasn't in identifying the danger, it was in not seeing what Hoffman had already seen, that Rennenkampf's halt had given the Germans time, and that time, on the East Prussian railway network, was convertible into position. Prittwitz saw the danger clearly. He simply failed to see the solution. The Russian artillery that broke Mackensen burned through its ammunition at rates the supply chain couldn't sustain. Nearly 440 rounds per battery in a single day against a doctrine that allowed for 244. After Gumbinnen, those batteries had nothing left for a second battle. The calculation is precise. Sustaining that fire rate for a pursuit would have required roughly 70,000 additional rounds delivered to forward positions within 18 hours. The Russian logistical system was physically incapable of this. The victory at Gumbinnen was, in a logistics sense, a one-time expenditure. And both sides, though neither knew it clearly at the time, now had approximately 10 days to reposition before the decisive engagement. Rennenkampf's halt gave those 10 days to Germany. Whether a more aggressive pursuit would have materially changed what followed is a question that can't be answered with certainty. Samsonov's army was still coming. It crossed the frontier the next day. The Germans still had Hoffman's plan. But an aggressive Russian exploitation of Gumbinnen would have complicated that plan significantly. It would have forced the German redeployment to move faster, under pressure, against an enemy that was pressing rather than waiting. Whether it would have been enough, whether Rennenkampf, with his strained supply lines and his uncoordinated cavalry, could have pressed hard enough and fast enough to prevent the encirclement of Samsonov, nobody can say. What we can say is that he didn't try. And in not trying, he gave Germany exactly the operational window it needed. The wire and the word. The radio intercept that decided the battle. There's a document in the history of American signals intelligence, a declassified analysis produced by the National Security Agency's Center for Cryptologic History, examining the origins of radio intercept as a military tool that contains a sentence I keep returning to. It describes the German interception of Russian radio traffic during the East Prussian campaign of August 1914 as, and I'm quoting directly, what is probably the world's first operationally decisive interception of enemy radio traffic in active battle conditions. The NSA produced that sentence. The NSA uses the word decisive carefully. It is not an organization given to casual superlatives about historical significance. When they write decisive, they mean it transformed the outcome. They mean that without it, the battle would have gone differently. They mean that a signal operator somewhere in East Prussia, pressing a receiver to his ear and transcribing Morse code in Russian plaintext, was contributing something as militarily significant as any corps commander or cavalry screen. The technical conditions that made this possible deserve explanation before we get to the dramatic moments, because the drama only makes sense if you understand the mechanism. Russian wireless telegraph stations in August 1914 operated on medium-wave frequencies, roughly between 300 and 600 kHz. At those frequencies, the ground wave propagation of a radio signal is predictable. A field station broadcasting at standard military power could be received reliably at distances between 150 and 300 kilometers under ordinary atmospheric conditions. German intercept stations at Thorn, at Königsberg, and at field positions throughout East Prussia were comfortably within that radius of any transmission Samsonov's army might make. The physics were in Germany's favor. What put the intelligence value in Germany's hands was the codebook situation. Samsonov had no codebook. This fact has been established earlier, but its operational consequences compound with each passing day of the campaign. The Russian Northwestern Front, Zhilinsky's command, had distributed codebooks to itself and to Rennenkampf. Samsonov's copy had not been delivered before the campaign began. This was documented as a known deficiency in Russian staff records. The decision to proceed anyway appears to have been based on the calculation that Samsonov could improvise, could send operationally sensitive information by field telephone when possible, and could use the wireless for less critical communications. The flaw in this reasoning was that the field telephone cable ran out within 2 days of crossing the border. After that, the wireless was all there was, and the wireless had no code. So Samsonov's army broadcast its operational orders, march routes, artillery dispositions, corps positions, supply states, daily objectives, in plain text, in Morse code, across frequencies that German intercept operators had been monitoring since before the campaign began. The Russian leadership knew this was happening. This is the part that I find hardest to sit with. Russian commanders at multiple levels understood that their wireless communications were being intercepted. They knew the Germans had broken their old cipher system. That's why a new one had been developed. That's why the new codebooks had been printed and distributed, except that not all of them had been distributed. Samsonov knew his messages were going out unencrypted. He knew they were being heard. He broadcast anyway, because the alternative, silence, operational isolation, commanding 5 corps across a 60-mile front with no communications at all, was in its own way equally fatal. He was choosing between 2 kinds of exposure. The German officers doing the interception spoke Russian. This is rarely noted in popular accounts. The 8th Army had an unusual concentration of Russian language officers, men from Baltic German aristocratic families that had for generations served in the Russian imperial system, whose children grew up in households where Russian was spoken alongside German, who had studied Russian literature and military manuals, and understood not just the language, but its military register. When a Russian corps commander sent a plaintext message in military Russian, these officers could read it in minutes. There was no translation delay, no interpretive uncertainty. The operational intelligence was essentially contemporaneous. The first significant intercept, approximately the 22nd or 23rd of August, was Rennenkampf's operational orders to his corps, sent in plain text. The content was, from a German planning perspective, transformative. It showed that the First Army was not turning south toward Samsonov. It was continuing northwest, toward Königsberg, in accordance with the original Russian campaign plan. Rennenkampf was not going to march to Samsonov's assistance. He didn't know Samsonov needed assistance. He thought he was pursuing a beaten German army toward the coast. But the Germans now knew that Rennenkampf was moving away. And if Rennenkampf was moving away, then the central risk of Hoffmann's encirclement plan, that concentrating against Samsonov would leave the German rear exposed to Rennenkampf crashing down from the north, was dramatically reduced. Then came the scene that every account of Tannenberg eventually reaches, because it's simply too cinematic to abbreviate. Hoffmann, on the afternoon of approximately the 25th of August, stopped at a signal station at Montovo and was handed two freshly transcribed intercepts. He glanced at them. Then he got back in his car and ordered his driver to accelerate. Ahead of him on the road, he could see the staff car carrying Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Without stopping, without signaling, Hoffmann had his driver pull alongside the moving car and simply thrust the intercept papers through the open window. Both vehicles came to a halt. Both messages were read. The first intercept was Rennenkampf's order, confirming the First Army was moving northwest, away from the battle area. The second was from Samsonov himself, his operational orders showing his force driving northwest, further and further into what he believed was the retreating German army's rear. In Samsonov's transmission, we can read his certainty. The Germans are running. He is pursuing. Victory is near. He was describing, in real time, his advance into the trap. Ludendorff later wrote that the intercepts seemed almost too good to be true. Neither commander initially suggested that the messages might be a Russian deception, false plaintext designed to mislead. That possibility, which would occur to any careful intelligence analyst, was apparently not seriously considered. The Germans assumed, correctly as events confirmed, that the Russians were broadcasting in the clear out of necessity rather than cunning. That assumption could have been catastrophically wrong. It wasn't, but it's worth noting that German confidence in the intercepts at this stage was as much a product of wishful thinking as of careful source assessment. What I find particularly striking about the intercept operation, beyond the operational consequences, is what it reveals about the specific communication failure that created it. The Russian army in August 1914 knew its ciphers had been compromised. It had prepared a replacement. It had printed the books. It had failed, at the critical administrative level, to distribute them to all commanders before operations began. The single most consequential intelligence windfall of the opening months of the First World War was created not by German technical brilliance, but by a Russian logistics failure at the level of codebook distribution. Somewhere in the Northwestern Front's administrative apparatus, someone had the authority and the responsibility to ensure Samsonov's Second Army headquarters received its codebook before crossing the German frontier. That person failed. The consequences were enormous. The intercept operation at Tannenberg is now recognized as the founding event of operational signals intelligence doctrine. Every subsequent development in military SIGINT, the British intercept operations of the later war years, the American communications intelligence programs of the Second World War, the enormous apparatus of the Cold War intelligence agencies, can trace a line of institutional and doctrinal inheritance back to what happened in East Prussia in August 1914. A Morse code operator in a field station, transcribing Russian plaintext on a summer afternoon, was, without knowing it, inaugurating a new branch of warfare, the Prussian timetable. How a railway beat an army. I want to be direct about what this chapter is. It is a chapter about railway engineering and logistics scheduling. It contains very little drama in the conventional sense. No generals making fateful decisions, no soldiers going forward under fire. What it contains is the actual mechanism of the encirclement, the physical process by which the German 8th Army moved a full infantry corps 150 kilometers by rail in 72 hours, deposited it on Samsonov's unguarded flank, and made everything that followed possible. If this chapter feels technical and detailed, that is because the reality was technical and detailed. The forests near Allenstein didn't fill with 90,000 Russian prisoners because of strategic vision alone. They filled because of railway schedule management, signal block systems, unloading platform logistics, and a man named Wilhelm Groener who didn't sleep for 3 days. The East Prussian railway network in August 1914 was not civilian infrastructure repurposed for military use. It was military infrastructure that also happened to serve civilians in peacetime. The German War Ministry had funded, over the preceding 3 decades, the deliberate expansion of the Prussian rail network in East Prussia with a specific strategic function in mind: rapid lateral movement between the 2 potential axes of Russian attack, north of and south of the Masurian Lakes. The line from the Insterburg area, where the 8th Army had been positioned for the Gumbinnen battle, to Deutsch-Eylau in the south, roughly 150 kilometers, was double-tracked for military purposes. The sidings, the loading platforms, the signal infrastructure, all were built to military specifications that prioritized throughput over economy. Every kilometer of that railway was, in a very literal sense, a pre-investment in the victory that was about to occur. It was not improvisation. It was a system designed for exactly this scenario, now executing its designed function. The man running the execution was Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Groener, the 8th Army's Chief of Field Railways. His name appears in very few popular accounts of Tannenberg. This is an oversight. What Groener managed between the 22nd and 25th of August 1914 was one of the most precisely executed logistical operations in the history of warfare to that point. German First Corps, approximately 40,000 men, 12,000 horses, 72 artillery pieces plus all associated ammunition, supply wagons, field kitchens, engineer equipment and medical trains, needed to be moved from the Insterburg-Gumbinnen area to the Deutsch-Eylau area, roughly 150 kilometers to the southwest, in time to close on Samsonov's left flank before the Russian advance went too deep for an encirclement to succeed. The railway could move 1 military train every 30 minutes, under the signal block system's minimum safe spacing. Groener pushed the interval to 28 minutes at peak loading. He cut standard unloading times from 60 to 90 minutes, down to 25 minutes per train. Think about what 25 minutes means in practice. A single military train carrying a German infantry regiment, somewhere in the range of 3,200 men, pulls into a platform that has been cleared by the preceding train exactly 30 minutes earlier. The men must exit the train, collect weapons and equipment staged on the platform, form into march columns, and move clear of the platform before the next train arrives. That is roughly 128 men per minute, moving with rifles, packs, personal equipment, and in many cases artillery horses and wagons, being led off flat cars down ramps that have to be positioned, locked, and cleared between each animal. At 3 in the morning, in August heat, after being on a train for hours, the operational log, the field railway log of the German 8th Army for August 22 to 25, records this in the flat, bureaucratic prose of a man who has agreed with himself that there is no time for drama. Train number, unit, platform, departure time, arrival time, unloading time completed, deviation from schedule, if any, with brief notation of cause. There are 12 deviations noted across 98 trains. One notation reads, "Delay due to horse injury on platform." A horse fell on a loading ramp at approximately 3 in the morning, and someone thought it worth recording. That is the level of precision at which this operation was being run. The physical weight involved in this movement is worth stating plainly. Working from standard figures for a German infantry corps of this period: men, horses, artillery, supplies, wagons. The total cargo of the First Corps movement approaches approximately 28,000 metric tons. Moved 150 kilometers through pine forest and agricultural land on a steam railway in 72 hours at an average effective delivery rate approaching 2 metric tons of military material per minute, sustained without interruption. This is roughly the cargo weight of a small ocean freighter, moving overland, on a wartime schedule, without a single catastrophic accident. The German railway signal block system that made the spacing possible worked on a combination of electric telegraph block instruments and semaphore signals. The minimum safe following distance between trains, the headway, was calculated from the maximum braking distance at the line's operating speed. At roughly 40 kilometers per hour, which was typical for military loaded trains on this type of track, the braking distance from emergency stop was approximately 700 meters. The block section length was set to ensure that no train could enter a section until the preceding train had cleared and confirmed it. Groner was running the system at very close to its theoretical maximum throughput, the equivalent of what traffic engineers today call saturation flow rate, with a safety margin that was real but not generous. He was betting that nothing would go catastrophically wrong for 72 consecutive hours. Nothing did. On the other side of the map, at this same moment, the Russian Second Army's supply wagons were covering approximately 30 kilometers per day on sand tracks. The comparison is simple arithmetic. A German soldier and his equipment moved 150 kilometers by rail in roughly 48 to 72 hours. A Russian supply of equivalent weight moved 30 kilometers per day by horse-drawn wagon. Getting the same supplies forward the same distance would have taken the Russian system roughly 5 to 6 days. In those same 5 to 6 days, the German system had closed First Corps on Samsonov's left flank, positioned it for the encirclement attack, and was in the process of reloading it for the final advance on Tannenberg. The operational tempo advantage wasn't 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. It was categorical. The German civilians streaming west along the same roads, the 870,000 refugees of East Prussia who had fled before the Russian advance, provide a human register for this movement that the operational logs can't. German soldiers on flat cars passing columns of German refugees on foot, both moving through the same landscape in opposite directions. The soldiers heading east toward the sound of artillery, the civilians heading west away from it. Multiple contemporary accounts from East Prussian refugees describe this scene. The trains passing, soldiers waving or calling out, the surreal moment of a retreating population and an advancing army sharing the same road. The refugees had lost their farms, their livestock, their household goods to Russian foraging and artillery damage. The trains moving toward the Russians were, to them, evidence that the army had not abandoned them. Whether that evidence would prove sufficient was still, at this moment, entirely unclear. The two German corps that Moltke panicked and transferred from the Western Front, the 11th Corps and the Guards Reserve Corps, are a necessary footnote to this chapter, though their story belongs more fully to what came after. Moltke ordered their transfer to East Prussia on approximately the 26th of August. They began in training from the Western Front on the 27th. Tannenberg effectively concluded on the 30th. The Corps arrived in East Prussia approximately in the first week of September. They were not needed. They had missed the battle entirely, and they were no longer available in France for the Battle of the Marne that began on the 5th of September. Whether those 50,000 men, if retained on the Western Front, would have been sufficient to tip the Marne is a question we'll examine in a later chapter. The unresolved arithmetic of it, troops moved for a battle already won, unavailable for a battle about to be lost, is one of the great strategic ironies of the entire First World War, and it was set in motion by the railway log we've been examining. The same trains that executed a tactical masterpiece may have contributed, in their successful completion, to a strategic failure their passengers never lived to fully understand. The General Who Would Not Wait, Francois and the Art of Creative Insubordination. Hermann von Francois was not a Prussian Junker. This matters more than it might initially seem. The German officer corps of 1914 was, at its senior levels, substantially a product of a specific social formation. Landed East Prussian families, Protestant, conservative, trained from adolescence in an institutional culture that treated obedience to the chain of command as a near-sacred professional obligation. Francois came from a Huguenot family with roots in Luxembourg. He was brilliant, technically accomplished, personally abrasive, and constitutionally unable to subordinate his own tactical judgment to the decisions of men he considered his intellectual inferiors. His pre-war service record contains multiple formal notations of difficult to command. His superiors found him exhausting. His men, by most accounts, found him impressive. He had the rare and dangerous quality of being frequently right about things his superiors were wrong about, and he knew it, and he made sure everyone else knew he knew it. His first act of disobedience in the East Prussian campaign came on the 17th of August, before Tannenberg, before Gumbinnen, before Hindenburg and Ludendorff had even been notified of their new appointments. Ordered to fall back from the frontier to a defensive line near Gumbinnen, Francois instead attacked the advancing Russian First Corps near Staliponen, only 5 miles from the Russian border. He watched the battle from a church steeple, a habit that would recur, directing fire with field telephone, while messages ordering him to stop arrived in increasingly urgent succession. A major general was dispatched in person to deliver the order. "Inform General von Prittwitz," Francois replied, "that General von Francois will break off the engagement when he has defeated the Russians." The Russian 27th Division was mauled, 3,000 prisoners taken. Francois eventually fell back as he'd been ordered, having demonstrated, to his own satisfaction, that his instincts were correct and his superior's caution was excessive. The formal complaint went to the Kaiser. Prittwitz was himself relieved 2 days later, which rather deflated the complaint. At Gumbinnen, it was Francois who jumped the gun, launching his First Corps attack before Mackensen's 17th Corps was in position. This was the disobedience that made the morning difficult. Francois' early attack alerted the Russian centre and gave them time to prepare before Mackensen arrived. His First Corps performed well. The centre broke anyway. The lesson, if Francois drew one, appears to have been that the problem wasn't his timing. It was everyone else's slowness. He remained unrepentant. He remained in command. And he was transported south by railway to the position where his specific combination of tactical instinct and magnificent stubbornness would prove decisive. The orders he received on the 25th of August from Ludendorff were to attack the Russian left flank, specifically General Artamanov's First Corps, at Ustau at dawn on the 26th of August. This attack was the left arm of the planned encirclement. Without it, Samsonov's left flank remained open, and the German ring couldn't close from the south. The order was unambiguous. Francois' response was also unambiguous. His heavy artillery hadn't finished detraining. His infantry could attack, but without the heavy howitzers, the assault on Artamanov's positions, which the Russians had been improving and digging for 2 days, would cost far more men than necessary and might fail entirely. He told Ludendorff he would attack, if ordered, with bayonets only. This was not dramatics. It was a precise technical statement about what happens to infantry attacking partially entrenched positions without artillery preparation. Ludendorff and Hindenburg were sufficiently alarmed that they got into a car and drove to First Corps headquarters to confront him in person. Francois showed them the railway schedule. The howitzer batteries would complete unloading by 10 in the morning. He attacked on the 27th with full artillery support and broke Artemonov's corps with approximately 90 minutes of howitzer fire before the Russian infantry gave way. Those howitzers were the German 21-centimeter Mörser, a weapon firing a shell of nearly 95 kilograms with a maximum range of approximately 9.5 kilometers. The technical value of this weapon wasn't primarily its range, it was its trajectory. Howitzers fire at high angles, sending shells on a steep downward arc that brings them almost vertically onto their targets. Troops in trenches, protected from flat trajectory fire that passes overhead or strikes the trench walls, are fully exposed to plunging fire that drops directly into the trench. Artemonov's First Corps had spent 2 days improving their defensive positions. They had done everything right by the doctrine of the time, and the 21-centimeter shells arrived from almost directly above into the positions they dug for 90 minutes. The corps broke. The Russian left flank collapsed. The gap that Francois' attack opened was the gap through which the encirclement would eventually close. The third act of disobedience was the decisive one. By the 28th of August, Samsonov's army was surrounded on 3 sides. The German plan called for First Corps to drive north, toward Allenstein, to complete the encirclement by pressing on the Russian rear. This was the orderly conclusion of the operational template. Close the ring from behind, compress the trapped force, collect the prisoners. Francois received the order. He looked at the map. He turned his corps east, toward Neidenberg, not north toward Allenstein, east, toward the one road that still offered Samsonov's encircled center a meaningful chance of escape. The 8th Army War Diary entry for the 28th of August reads, with the clipped precision of institutional documentation, First Corps has turned east. This deviates from the operation order. Ludendorff, when he received the report, was, by the accounts of those present, extremely displeased. What Ludendorff had ordered would have tightened the ring from the top. What Francois did slammed the door at the bottom. 90,000 Russians were inside the pocket. The door was closed. The deviating general was right again. What the Francois story exposes, beneath the dramatic insubordination, is a genuine tension at the heart of German military doctrine that 1914 didn't resolve. The concept of Auftragstaktik, what military doctrine today calls mission command, was a core German institutional principle. Subordinate commanders were authorized to deviate from specific orders if deviation better served the intent of those orders. This was designed to enable faster decision-making in the confusion of battle, to prevent the paralysis that occurred when rigid adherence to orders met unexpected reality. At Tannenberg, it worked spectacularly. Francois' 3 acts of creative disobedience each served the intent of the encirclement plan better than literal compliance with the specific orders would have. But the doctrine doesn't come with a mechanism for distinguishing the Francois who's right from the subordinate commander who's wrong and arrogant in equal measure. The lesson of Francois is not that disobedience is virtuous. It is that sometimes the man on the ground can see what the map at headquarters cannot. Distinguishing those cases in real time, while bullets and shells are landing and the railway log has to be updated, is what separates generalship from gambling. The near miss of Francois' removal before the battle is a footnote that deserves not to be a footnote. Prittwitz, before his own relief, had filed formal complaints about Francois' Stallupönen insubordination that were working their way up the command chain. Had Pritvitz himself not been removed first, the complaints might have resulted in Francois being replaced with a more compliant corps commander. A compliant corps commander would have attacked on the 26th without his artillery, might have failed to break Artemonov, and would certainly have turned north toward Allenstein on the 28th as ordered. The pocket might not have closed. The story of Tannenberg might have been rather different. Not a German defeat, but a partial success rather than an annihilation. History turned, in this instance, on the administrative timing of one general's relief of command. Pritvitz was removed just in time to leave Francois in position, to be disobedient in ways that won the battle. The contingency of it is, I think, underappreciated. The country is devastated. Samsonov's last days. Alexander Samsonov was an asthmatic cavalry officer, recalled from sick leave to command 200,000 men in a region he had never visited, under orders he had argued against, through a communication system he couldn't trust, toward an enemy whose positions he couldn't determine. The Russian military records describe him as a competent cavalry commander from earlier campaigns, a man of genuine professional experience. They don't describe him as the man for this specific situation, at this specific moment, under these specific constraints. Nobody was, quite, that man. But Samsonov got the job. His asthma matters and deserves clinical precision, because military histories almost universally mention it as a character detail, as atmosphere, and then move on without examining what it actually meant for the man's capacity to function. In 1914, asthma was managed where it was managed at all, with atropine-based preparations and caffeine compounds, neither of which significantly addresses bronchospasm under conditions of physical exertion, heat, dust, and sustained stress. Samsonov was advancing through East Prussia in August temperatures, on horseback, through dust-churned sand roads, under the accumulated psychological pressure of commanding an army he couldn't speak to. The physiological consequences, reduced blood oxygen saturation, accelerated fatigue, compromised cognitive processing under stress, are not trivial. The Russian medical records from this period lack the detail to quantify the impairment precisely, but it is there, invisible in the operational documents, present in the physical man who was trying to hold an army together. His dispatches in the days before the encirclement are among the most revealing documents in the entire Tannenberg archive. Not revealing in the way that post-war critics made them, as evidence of incompetence or panicking, but revealing as the precise record of a man making accurate technical assessments that his superiors refused to accept. On the 24th of August, he telegraphed Zhilinsky, "The country is devastated. The horses have long been without oats, and there is no bread." This is not a dramatic complaint. It is a logistical situation report, phrased in the flat language of someone who has stopped dressing things up. The horses have no oats. There is no bread. These are statements of fact. Zhilinsky's response was to order the advance to continue. Zhilinsky used language that bordered on contempt. Hurry up the advance. Hasten operations. As if the sand roads and the empty supply wagons were a failure of will rather than a failure of infrastructure. Samsonov asked for a rest halt. He argued for it repeatedly in the days between the 23rd and 25th of August. A single day's halt, he calculated, would allow supply wagons to close the gap and give his infantry, who had been marching for 9 consecutive days in summer heat, time to recover something of their operational capacity. Zhilinsky refused every request. The exchange is documented in the Northwestern Front War Diary. Samsonov asking with increasing formality, Zhilinsky refusing with increasing impatience. The two men were, in a functional sense, arguing about whether the army was a logistical reality or a strategic intention, and the man who controlled the orders believed it was an intention and refused to be argued out of it by a man who was standing in the sand and could see the reality. By the 26th of August, when the Battle of Tannenberg began in earnest, Samsonov had already lost operational control of 2 of his 5 corps. The 6th Corps under Blagoveshensky on the right flank and the 1st Corps under Artemonov on the left were beyond his communication range. He could not reach them by wire. The cable had run out. He could not trust wireless messages to remain private. He was commanding, in effective terms, the 2 corps physically nearest his headquarters, Kliuev's 13th and Martos's 15th, while the flanking corps effectively operated independently. He knew his flanks were exposed. His aerial reconnaissance, a handful of aircraft with limited operational range, had spotted what appeared to be German movement on the left. He didn't know its scale. He didn't know its direction. He knew something was there, somewhere to the west and southwest, and he had no reliable mechanism to find out exactly what. His decision on the 26th and 27th to order his center to press further northwest is the operational error most consistently cited against him. It drove the 13th and 15th Corps deeper into the trap as the German wings were closing. Russian staff officer memoirs written after the war, in emigration, disagree about how conscious Samsonov was of the danger at this stage. Some describe him as still believing he was chasing a retreating enemy. Some describe him as aware that something was wrong, but without enough information to understand what. What the documents show clearly is that the orders from Zhilinsky through this period continued to demand offensive action. Samsonov was being pushed from behind, even as the walls closed in front. On the 28th of August, Samsonov travelled forward to the front himself. He found his headquarters unable to reach any of the 5 corps by either wire or wireless. He was commanding an army he couldn't speak to, in a forest where every track looked like the previous one, with guides who themselves weren't certain of their positions. He dictated a final telegram to Zhilinsky. The surviving text of this message is not long. Its final sentence, "I accept responsibility for everything," has been read in different ways by different historians. As a soldier's formal statement of command accountability, as the last line of a man who has already decided what comes next. Perhaps both readings are simultaneously true. That night, Samsonov walked into the Grünflies forest with a small group of staff officers, separated from them in the darkness, and did not emerge. Several officers who were with him through that final movement report hearing a single gunshot from the direction he had taken. His body was found by German search parties. The German 8th Army directed that he be buried with full military honours. He was. He was a general. He had lost an army. He had been placed in command of that army under conditions that made catastrophe close to inevitable, and he had argued against those conditions with the specific, documented precision of a man who understood exactly what was happening and couldn't stop it. His remains were eventually repatriated to Russia. In the Soviet period, his name largely disappeared from official military history. Tannenberg was too catastrophic, too attributable to the systemic failures of a political order the Soviets had replaced, and Samsonov fitted neither the category of hero nor of class enemy. He was simply allowed to not exist in official memory. The Russian Orthodox tradition was more careful with him. It tends to be. The staff officer memoirs from the final days inside the pocket are difficult reading. Not because of their dramatic intensity. Many of them are written in a flat, shocked prose that suggests men still processing what they survived, years after they survived it. They're difficult because of how completely the grand narrative disappears at the individual level. A Russian artillery lieutenant named Krylev, writing in Paris in 1923 in an émigré publication that no Anglophone archive has ever translated, describes the morning of the 29th of August with a specificity that no operational history can replicate. He no longer knew which men around him were from his own battery, which from his regiment, which from units he had never heard of. He knew the direction of the German guns. He knew there was forest in every other direction. He knew he was hungry. The Battle of Tannenberg, for Krylev, had contracted to about 400 square meters of East Prussian pine forest. The map at 8th Army headquarters showing the encirclement in its entirety was invisible to him. It was as invisible as the radio intercepts and the railway schedule and the codebook that wasn't delivered and the French treaty that started all of this. He was just a man in a forest who was hungry and who could hear German guns. Inside the ring, witness testimonies from the pocket. By the morning of the 29th of August, 1914, the Russian Second Army had ceased to exist as an operational military formation. This is the cold, institutional language. The experiential reality was different in texture, messier, more fragmented, more individual. What the encirclement looked like from outside, from the German operational maps and headquarters photographs and prisoner processing records, was a clean, geometric exercise. Wings closing, center compressed, ring sealed. What it looked like from inside was a forest, filling with men who no longer knew where their unit was, where the enemy was, or which direction led anywhere except deeper into the trees. The Nevsky Regiment's breakout attempt in the darkness of the 28th to 29th of August is one of the few actions inside the pocket that has been recorded in enough detail to reconstruct with some precision. Elements of the Russian 13th Corps, their situation already desperate, formed for an attack on a German position across an open clearing. They went forward. They crossed the clearing under German fire. They reached the far tree line and found German machine gun posts. They fell back. They formed again and attacked a second time, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. The regiment had had no food or water for 2 days. The men making these charges were doing so on empty stomachs, through the night, in August heat that hadn't broken even after dark, attacking positions they couldn't see clearly and couldn't flank and couldn't bypass. After the fifth charge, the regiment dissolved into the surrounding forest. They were taken prisoner the following day, or the day after that, or were among the thousands whose fate was never definitively recorded. The German searchlights deserve a moment, because they appear in multiple Russian survivor accounts as one of the most disorienting elements of the final night. German engineer units had requisitioned field searchlights, equipment primarily designed for harbor defense and anti-aircraft work, drawn from the Königsberg coastal installations, and positioned them at the perimeter of the encirclement. The arc lamp units produced an extraordinary intensity of light. Modern estimates place the output of comparable units at roughly 3 to 4 billion candle power. When those lights came on, open ground that had been covered by darkness was instantly illuminated in harsh white light. Russian soldiers who had been moving through dark forest for hours, whose eyes had adjusted to near total darkness, emerged from the tree line and were immediately blinded and silhouetted. The machine gun posts behind the lights had clear fields of fire. The psychology of it, the sudden impossibility of cover, the exposure that arrived without warning, runs through the survivor accounts as a consistent detail. Men who had survived artillery barrages and frontal assaults, describing the searchlights as the moment they understood, at a physical level, that there was nowhere to go. The drowning at Bosau Lake is less precisely documented, but appears in enough independent accounts to be treated as established. Russian units pressed back against the lake shore, a glacial lake, cold even in August, roughly 3 kilometers across at its widest point, found themselves with German infantry in the tree line behind them and water in front. The exact number of men who entered the water is not recorded in any source I've encountered. The number who drowned is similarly unrecorded. The German after-action reports mention recovering Russian equipment from the lake shore. The Russian survivor accounts mention men going into the water. The gap between those two facts contains a body count that was never formally taken. The prisoner processing at Osterode on the 29th and 30th of August was a logistical crisis that the German Eighth Army had not adequately planned for. This is documented plainly in German administrative records, not as an accusation, but as a fact. German prisoner of war planning before the campaign had estimated tens of thousands of prisoners at most, spread over a period of weeks. Tannenberg delivered somewhere between 70,000 and 92,000 prisoners within approximately 72 hours. The discrepancy between those two figures, the contemporaneous German operational records giving the lower number, Hindenburg's memoir giving the higher, is a source problem we'll address in a later chapter. What isn't disputed is that the volume was catastrophically larger than any planning assumption had anticipated. Food, water, shelter, guards, medical care, rail transport to camps, every element of prisoner management had to be improvised on a scale for which there was no template. The German Eighth Army's observance of the Hague regulations on prisoner treatment during this period stands as a documented fact that sits in strange juxtaposition to the scale of the operation. Russian officers were entitled, under the 1907 Hague Convention, to retain their swords and sidearms, and to receive accommodation befitting their rank. The German records show these provisions were honoured. Russian officers were housed in requisitioned East Prussian manor houses, some of which had been abandoned by their owners during the refugee flight. They were fed from German officer mess provisions. Hindenburg personally received the surrender of 2 Russian corps commanders at Osterode. The formality of those surrenders, the rituals of military courtesy maintained in full, the salutes exchanged, the swords retained, exists in a kind of moral parallel universe to everything that had happened in the preceding 5 days. War has always contained these contradictions. The Tannenberg case simply makes them unusually visible. The approximately 10,000 Russian soldiers who escaped the encirclement did so from the flanking corps. Artemanov's first corps on the left, already broken before the ring fully closed, and Blagoveshchensky's 6th Corps on the right, which retreated southeast before complete encirclement was achieved. The men who escaped the pocket itself, who were inside the ring when it closed, numbered very few. The accounts of those who did are extraordinary documents of physical endurance. Walking southeast through German-held East Prussia, navigate by stars and by the sound of distant artillery, living on mushrooms and creek water, hiding during daylight and moving at night, covering 40 to 80 kilometers over 3 to 4 days, before reaching Russian-held territory or the ambiguous safety of Polish civilian farmland. Several of these men wrote memoirs in the Russian émigré press during the 1920s. Their accounts share a specific quality, a complete absence of the operational narrative. They don't know they are survivors of a battle called Tannenberg. They know they are lost men in a forest, moving toward what they hope is safety, eating what they can find. The 500 or so Russian artillery pieces captured in the encirclement and its immediate aftermath represent a specific logistical challenge that German salvage units worked on for weeks. At an average weight of roughly 1,100 kilograms per field gun, plus its limber and ammunition wagon, the total captured artillery equipment represented several hundred tons of metal and wood scattered across 60 miles of East Prussian farmland and forest. Some pieces were recoverable intact. Some had been disabled by their crews. Some were buried in the sand that had slowed and eventually stopped so many of the men who had tried to haul them forward. German salvage teams found guns, wagons, ammunition boxes, field kitchens, medical crates, personal equipment, and, in quantities that the reports note without elaboration, large numbers of discarded Russian boots. What I find myself returning to, reading the accumulation of these fragments, Krulev's 400 square meters, the Nevsky Regiment's 5 charges, the searchlights, the lake, is the distance between the scale at which the battle is typically described and the scale at which it was experienced. The operational history is true. The encirclement was complete. The numbers are real. And simultaneously, inside those numbers, were individual men doing individual things in individual minutes, most of whom left no record at all. The 90,000 prisoners were, individually, one person each. The 30,000 dead were individually dead, one at a time. The historian's obligation is to hold both scales simultaneously, the strategic and the personal, without letting one erase the other. This is harder than it sounds. The name they chose, why Tannenberg and not Allenstein? The battle was not fought at Tannenberg. This is not a disputed historical point. It is a geographical fact. The engagement we know as the Battle of Tannenberg was fought in the district around Allenstein, modern Olsztyn, roughly 30 kilometers east of the village of Tannenberg. The battle's major engagements occurred near Ustau, Hohenstein, Ortelsburg, Neidenberg, and the forests between them. Tannenberg itself, a small agricultural village of a few hundred people, saw no significant combat. It was a place the German command motorcade drove through on the 24th of August, 1914, while travelling between headquarters and the front. Hindenburg noticed the ruins of a Teutonic Order castle. He had been thinking, he later wrote, about the defeat of the Teutonic Knights at this location in 1410, and a decision was made. The First Battle of Tannenberg in 1410, also known as Grunwald in the Polish and Lithuanian tradition, was one of the most consequential military events in medieval Northern European history. A combined Polish-Lithuanian army under Władysław II Jagiełło destroyed the military power of the Teutonic Knights, a crusading German order that had dominated the region for 2 centuries. The defeat effectively ended Teutonic expansion and began a long period of Polish-Lithuanian regional dominance. In German nationalist historical consciousness, the Battle of 1410 was a wound that hadn't entirely closed. In 1910, Polish and Lithuanian nationalists held a major centennial celebration at the Grunwald battlefield, an event that German nationalists experienced as a provocation. Hindenburg had been thinking about 1410 since the previous evening, when he'd walked near the Teutonic castle ruins during a late stroll. When the motorcade drove through the village on the 24th, the thought was already there. The operational records of the 8th Army call the battle, in their initial entries, by variants of the battle near Ortelsburg-Gilgenberg, geographically accurate, strategically meaningful, and completely without mythological resonance. The name Tannenberg appears in the official German communiqué issued approximately the 1st of September, 1914. No surviving internal document shows who proposed the name change. Hindenburg's memoir, published in 1920, claims the idea as his own. Hoffmann's diary doesn't mention it. The Polish press, covering the battle with understandable care, studiously avoided repeating the German name. They had no interest in amplifying a piece of German nationalist symbolism that explicitly framed a 1914 German victory over Russian Slavs as the avenging of a 1410 defeat by Polish-Lithuanian Slavs. The silence was deliberate and articulate. The propaganda architecture of the naming is visible once you look for it. The name Tannenberg simultaneously invoked 3 distinct but mutually reinforcing narratives for a German domestic audience. First, historical revenge. The 1410 wound healed, the Teutonic Knights' memory honored. Second, civilizational struggle. The framing of the Russian enemy as part of the same Slavic force that had defeated the German order 5 centuries earlier, casting 1914 as a continuation of a very old conflict. Third, East Prussian Protestant German identity. The Teutonic Knights were the founders of what became the Prussian state, and the region's German population had a specific cultural connection to their memory that the naming activated. 3 narrative registers, simultaneously fired by 2 syllables. The technique was not accidental. Someone in the German command structure understood propaganda architecture, and the naming of Tannenberg is one of the cleaner examples of what we would now call strategic communication. the deliberate alignment of a military event with pre-existing cultural narratives to maximize domestic political effect. The Tannenberg Memorial, the physical monument constructed between 1924 and 1927, made this architecture concrete, literally. The architects, Walter and Johannes Kruger, designed an octagonal structure enclosing an open courtyard with 8 towers at its perimeter, built from regional stone and concrete. Their design notes, preserved in the Architectural Archive, explicitly reference descriptions of prehistoric megalithic monuments, Stonehenge among them, alongside medieval Teutonic fortress architecture. The goal was to suggest that German national memory was rooted not in specific historical events, but in something older and more elemental: blood, land, permanence. This language, with its specifically pre-Christian undertones, predates the Nazi adoption of similar imagery by nearly a decade. The architects weren't Nazis. Their building was appropriated by Nazism with the ease of water finding a carved channel. The memorial cost approximately 2.9 million Reichsmarks, funded by national subscription during the Weimar Republic period, a significant financial commitment during an era of economic instability and political turmoil. The subscription campaigns were organized partly through veterans organizations and partly through German nationalist political groups. The money given to build the Tannenberg Memorial was money given to a specific interpretation of what Germany was and what had happened to it. A donation to narrative, not simply to stone. When Hindenburg delivered the dedication speech on the 18th of September, 1927, he used the occasion to reject the war guilt clause of the Versailles Treaty in terms that electrified the German political right and alarmed the Allied powers. Germany did not cause this war. The dedication of a war memorial had become a foreign policy statement. Hindenburg died in August 1934. Hitler presided over his burial in the Tannenberg Memorial Crypt, a ceremony that fused the Weimar Republic's soldier president, the First World War's greatest German victory, the Teutonic Knights' medieval memory, and the new Nazi state's founding mythology into a single ritual. The connection between the 1914 battle and the 1934 burial was not accidental. It was the culmination of 20 years of deliberate myth construction. The monument that had been built to honor a military victory had become the spiritual architecture of a political order. German forces dynamited the Tannenberg Memorial in January 1945 as the Red Army's massive winter offensive swept across East Prussia. The demolition was ordered to prevent Soviet capture of a structure that had become a major German national symbol. Hindenburg's coffin was removed before the detonation, evacuated westward, eventually coming to rest in a church at Marburg, in what would become West Germany, where it remains. The 8 towers fell. The courtyard collapsed into rubble. The stone and concrete that had taken 3 years to build was reduced in a morning. The site today is a field near the Polish village of Stembach. The foundations of the perimeter wall are still partially visible, concrete courses emerging from the ground like geological strata, the structural skeleton of a demolished myth. A Polish National Heritage Board survey, completed in 2009, describes them in the flat language of archaeological documentation. Visible remains consist primarily of foundation courses of the former memorial perimeter wall, several concrete anchor points for flagpole bases, and disturbed subsurface stratigraphy. Nobody maintains the site as a memorial. There is no interpretive signage in Polish acknowledging what happened there in 1410, in 1914, or in 1927. The landscape has, in a sense, exercised its own editorial judgment. What the naming of Tannenberg ultimately shows is how quickly a military event can be converted into political capital, and how durable that capital can be. The battle was won in 5 days. The myth was built over 15 years. The myth lasted longer than the Weimar Republic that incubated it, longer than the Third Reich that used it, longer, arguably, than any honest reckoning with its consequences. The village of Tannenberg was never a battlefield. It was always just a name. The power of that name, chosen on a morning drive by a general with a historical grievance and a nose for symbolism, shaped German politics for 2 decades. The general who was not blamed. Zielinski and the architecture of Russian accountability. Yakov Zielinski commanded the Russian Northwestern Front from its establishment in July 1914 through the catastrophe of August and into September. He commanded the 2 armies that were supposed to trap the German 8th Army in a double envelopment. One of those armies, Rennenkampf's first, won a genuine battle at Gumbinnen and then failed to exploit it. The other, Samsonov's second, was encircled and destroyed. Zielinski commanded both. He issued the orders that pushed Samsonov forward past the point of logistical sustainability. He failed to coordinate the 2 armies. He refused rest halts that might have slowed the advance into the trap. He administered a Northwestern Front headquarters that failed to deliver Samsonov's codebook before the campaign began. After the battle, he was transferred to a position as Russia's military representative at French General Headquarters in Paris. He was not court-martialed. He was not publicly censured. He was moved sideways, quietly, in the way that powerful institutional failures are managed when the consequences of honest accounting would be worse than the cost of concealment. To understand why Zielinski was treated this way, you have to understand his specific position in the Russian military political structure before the war. He was Russia's representative at the Franco-Russian military staff conferences of 1911 through 1913. In those conferences, he personally confirmed Russia's commitment to the 15-day mobilization timeline. He looked French military planners in the eye and told them Russian armies would be in contact with German forces 15 days after the declaration of war. He had staked his professional credibility on a promise that the Russian military system could barely keep, and that the Russian logistics system in East Prussia couldn't support at all. When Samsonov's telegrams arrived, describing an army without bread or oats, Zielinski was not simply receiving bad news. He was receiving evidence that the promise he had made was impossible. His refusal to acknowledge the logistical reality, his insistence on continued advance, his contemptuous dismissal of Samsonov's requests, was the behavior of a man protecting a commitment he couldn't afford to admit was wrong. The Russian army's subsequent inquiry into Tannenberg, established by Grand Duke Nicholas in the autumn of 1914, reached conclusions that were never fully published. This itself is informative. The commission existed. Its work was genuine enough to generate documentation. The documentation was classified and remains partially inaccessible. What filtered through into military memoirs and official histories written during the remaining years of the Tsarist period is a narrative that attributes the disaster primarily to Samsonov's operational errors and Rennenkampf's failure to support. Individual failures by individual commanders, not a systemic indictment of the command architecture, the treaty obligations, or the logistical planning. Zielinski appears in this narrative as a background figure who made mistakes but operated within a framework that would have challenged any commander. The framework itself is not on trial. The reason the framework couldn't be on trial is straightforward. To publicly indict the Russian mobilization doctrine, the 15-day timetable, the advance before supply lines were ready, the acceptance of codebook shortage as a calculated risk, would be to indict the Franco-Russian alliance itself. In the autumn of 1914, Russia was still fighting. France was still fighting. The alliance was essential to both. Admitting that the alliance's mobilization requirements had sent 200,000 men into a trap was politically impossible. The alternative was to find individual generals who had failed, manage their careers quietly, and maintain the appearance of systemic integrity. This is not unique to Russia or to 1914. Institutions under catastrophic stress almost universally choose the individual sacrifice over the systemic indictment. The cost is that the system doesn't learn. The codebook failure is, in this context, particularly revealing. The Northwestern Front headquarters was responsible for distributing codebooks to the armies under its command before operations began. Samsonov's Second Army headquarters did not receive its codebook. This is documented. The responsibility for that failure lies in Zhilinsky's administrative chain, not in Samsonov's headquarters, which couldn't distribute a codebook it hadn't been given. The Russian inquiry did not formally assign accountability for this failure to anyone. The German after-action analysis, based on the intercept records, identifies the moment when Samsonov's transmissions shifted from coded to plain text and traces the operational consequences through the entire battle. The Germans knew exactly what the missing codebook had cost Russia. The Russian inquiry apparently preferred not to make the same calculation in writing. Rennenkampf's position in the accountability architecture is almost as revealing as Zhilinsky's. His failure to pursue after Gumbinnen, the halt that gave Germany its operational window, was noted in subsequent historical accounts, but Rennenkampf continued to command the First Army until November 1914, when a further significant failure at Lodz finally produced his relief. He wasn't sanctioned for Gumbinnen. The message this sent through the Russian officer corps is worth considering. The general whose failure to pursue had made the encirclement of his colleague's army possible suffered no immediate professional consequence. The general whose army was encircled walked into a forest and shot himself. The asymmetry of those two outcomes is not merely ironic. It is instructive about which kinds of failure the Russian institutional culture of 1914 could accommodate and which it could not. The Northwestern Front's communication structure deserves specific examination as a technical failure. The front-level headquarters, under Zhilinsky, had no organic air section, no dedicated signals intelligence function, and no staff mechanism capable of synthesizing the available intelligence. Aerial reconnaissance, captured Russian officers' reports, wireless intercepts, into a coherent operational picture. The front staff was a thin administrative layer between Stavka, Russian Supreme Headquarters, and the army commanders, designed for peacetime coordination rather than wartime operational management. Compare this to the German 8th Army's operations section under Hoffmann, which was synthesizing intercepts, aerial reports, and prisoner interrogation into an updated operational picture every few hours. The structural disparity wasn't a matter of individual talent, it was a matter of institutional design. The Russian system hadn't been built to fight the kind of war that 1914 required. What the post-Tannenberg reforms eventually produced is worth noting, because the Russian army was not without institutional learning capacity. It simply learned slowly and at enormous cost. By the winter of 1914 to 15, Russian field signal companies were operating with explicit requirements for minimum cable reserve, the lesson of Tannenberg written in kilometers of wire. Codebook distribution procedures were reviewed and tightened. The specific operational overextension that had placed Samsonov's 5 corps spread over 60 miles with collapsing flanks was recognized in doctrine and partially corrected. These were incomplete reforms, implemented too slowly and under the continued pressure of active operations. But they existed. The system was trying to learn. The tragedy is the scale of the tuition it had paid. Zhilinsky died in 1918, the year the Russian Empire collapsed entirely. He lived to see the end of the political order whose military failures he had helped to enable, and whose accountability structures had protected him from their consequences. In the Soviet historiography that followed, he is a minor figure at best, too entangled with the Tsarist system to be rehabilitated, too marginal to be worth the energy of a full indictment. His role in the Tannenberg disaster, the refused rest halts, the contemptuous orders, the administrative failure of the codebook, the post-battle management of his own career, sits mostly undiscussed in the major Anglophone histories. He remains in the landscape of Tannenberg scholarship, the general who was not blamed. The wound the Marne never healed. Two corps and the strategic paradox. On approximately the 26th of August, 1914, while the Battle of Tannenberg was reaching its decisive phase, German Supreme Headquarters made a decision that is recorded in the OHL operations log with bureaucratic brevity. Transfer of 11th Corps and Guards Reserve Corps to 8th Army approved. Departure of first trains, 27th August. The entry has a footnote. The footnote was added later, in different handwriting, by someone reviewing the log after the fact. It reads, Corps arrived East Prussia after Tannenberg concluded, not employed in battle. That footnote is one of the most quietly devastating operational notations in the entire German First World War archive. 50,000 men moved from France to East Prussia. Tannenberg over before they arrived. Not needed in the East. No longer available in the West. Helmuth von Moltke, the German chief of the General Staff, the man who had notified Hindenburg and Ludendorff of their East Prussian appointments, the man who had modified the Schlieffen Plan in ways that haunted the opening German campaign in France, made the transfer decision in a state of genuine alarm. The reports from East Prussia in the days before Tannenberg were not reassuring. Prittwitz had panicked and proposed retreat to the Vistula. Even after his replacement, the intelligence picture of two Russian armies threatening the province was genuinely concerning. Moltke was simultaneously managing the Great German Wheel through Belgium and northern France, and watching East Prussia seem to teeter. He made the calculation that the Eastern crisis required immediate reinforcement. He ordered 2 corps from von Kluck's First Army, the right-wing spearhead of the Western campaign, to detrain and move east. The timing problem is mathematical. The Battle of Tannenberg was effectively decided between the 28th and 30th of August. The transferred corps began moving east on the 27th. They arrived in East Prussia approximately the 6th to 8th of September. The battle they were sent to support was already won when their trains crossed into East Prussia. They detrained, received situation briefings about a victory that had occurred in their absence, and were assigned to the subsequent Masurian Lakes campaign against Rennenkampf. They were useful there, but the Western Front, from which they'd been pulled, needed them between the 5th and 12th of September. That was when the First Battle of the Marne was fought. The Marne is one of the most analysed battles in military history, and the question of whether the corps transfer materially contributed to the German failure there has generated genuine scholarly disagreement. The argument for significant impact runs as follows. Von Kluck's First Army and von Bülow's Second Army, advancing through northern France toward Paris, developed a gap between their forces as the campaign progressed, a gap that French aerial reconnaissance identified and that General Joffre exploited in his September counterattack. The gap existed partly because of the aggressive pace of the German advance, partly because of command coordination failures between Kluck and Bülow, and partly because both armies had been thinned by earlier detachments and losses. The two transferred corps, roughly 50,000 men with artillery and support, might, in the argument for their significance, have been sufficient to reduce or close the gap. A narrower gap would have been a harder target for Joffre's counterattack. A harder target might have held. The counter-argument is that the Marne was lost for reasons largely independent of those two corps. Kluck's decision to wheel his army eastward, turning toward Paris's eastern flank rather than encircling the city from the west, was a command decision made on the basis of battlefield intelligence, not a consequence of insufficient numbers. The coordination failure between First and Second Armies was a communications and command culture problem that 50,000 additional men wouldn't have resolved. Moltke himself, by early September, was receiving conflicting reports from the front, was in poor health, and was making decisions with insufficient information. The structural problems of the German Western campaign, the modifications to the Schlieffen Plan, the understrength right wing even before the transfers, the extended supply lines, pre-existed the core transfer. The counter-argument's version of events. Germany was going to lose the Marne anyway. The core transfer made it marginally worse, not categorically different. The honest position, which this series will maintain, is that counterfactual history at this scale cannot be resolved with certainty. What can be said, without qualification, is that the transferred core were not needed where they went, and were absent where they might have mattered. The arithmetic is irrefutable. The operational significance of that arithmetic depends on a chain of assumptions about battlefield mechanics that neither side of the debate can prove conclusively. Moltke's nervous breakdown on the 14th of September. He was relieved of command on that date, replaced by Falkenhayn, and the replacement was concealed from the German public and most of the government for over 2 months, suggests that Moltke himself believed the situation was catastrophic. His reported last words as Chief of Staff, according to those present, "Your Majesty, we have lost the war." Whether the core transfer was among the reasons he believed this, or whether he was simply overwhelmed by the totality of the Western campaign's failure, the record doesn't clearly show. What makes the strategic paradox of Tannenberg genuinely interesting, rather than simply ironic, is that the core transfer decision was rational, given the information Moltke had at the time. He didn't know Tannenberg was already effectively won. He knew East Prussia was threatened by 2 Russian armies, that the previous commander had panicked, and that the new commanders had been in post for only a few days. The political consequences of losing East Prussia, ancestral homeland of the Prussian state, the Kaiser's agricultural base, the emotional center of German conservative identity, were real and enormous. Moltke wasn't panicking irrationally. He was managing a genuine crisis with limited information and enormous competing pressures. The decision was defensible in its moment. Its consequences were catastrophic. The British Royal Flying Corps adds one of the greater ironies to this chapter. On the 3rd of September 1914, while the German advance was still progressing, and before the Marne counterattack had begun, aircraft of No. 3 Squadron RFC flew reconnaissance over the German columns east of Paris and identified the open flank developing between Kluck's First Army and Bülow's Second Army. Their reports were passed to French Sixth Army and to Joffre's headquarters. The aerial observation was among the first operationally decisive uses of military aviation in the entire war's history. German aerial reconnaissance had identified Russian positions at Tannenberg, enabling the German encirclement. British aerial reconnaissance identified the German gap at the Marne, enabling the Allied counterattack. 2 sides used the same technology in the same month to equivalent operational effect. One winning a complete tactical victory, the other stopping a war from being decided. The symmetry is precise enough to be uncomfortable. Moltke never fully recovered from September 1914. He lived until 1916, but was functionally finished as a military figure after his relief. The German command had concealed his breakdown from the public. The army was fighting in France, public confidence couldn't be risked. And he spent 2 years in the shadow of a decision he believed had cost Germany the war. Whether he was right about that, whether the core transfer was the decisive factor, or simply one factor among many, is a question that historians have been arguing about for over a century. What isn't in dispute is the footnote in the OHL operations log. Corps arrived East Prussia after Tannenberg concluded, not employed in battle. The trains had run perfectly, the plan had worked, the victory was complete. And somewhere to the west, in the gap between 2 German armies advancing on Paris, something else was happening that would determine whether any of it ultimately mattered. The Eastern Front opens, Tannenberg's offspring. The battle was over on the 30th of August, 1914. The mopping up, collecting prisoners, cataloguing captured equipment, burying the dead, continued for days afterward. And then, before the Eighth Army had finished processing what it had just done, before the prisoner trains had cleared the East Prussian stations, before Hindenburg had finished composing his report to the Kaiser, Hoffmann was already looking north. Rennenkampf's First Army was still in East Prussia. It had watched Tannenberg happen from a distance, done nothing of consequence to prevent it, and was now sitting in a position that the German Eighth Army, freshly victorious and still concentrated, was uniquely positioned to address. Hindenburg had said it before the battle began. We must not merely defeat Samsonov, we must annihilate him. Now the language was applied to Rennenkampf. The Eighth Army was not finished. It had simply changed targets. The German Eighth Army Operations Order dated approximately the 4th of September 1914. The order initiating what would become the first battle of the Masurian Lakes begins with a sentence of almost bureaucratic calm. The Eighth Army, having destroyed the Russian Second Army, now turns its attention to the Russian First Army. Reading it now, the administrative composure is remarkable. The army that had just encircled and destroyed a force of roughly 200,000 men was issuing a new operations order with the procedural smoothness of a staff that had never stopped functioning. This was precisely the point. The Eighth Army's command culture, Hoffmann's operations section, Groener's railway teams, the corps and divisional staffs that had executed the Tannenberg plan, was still intact, still running, still capable of translating operational concept into railway schedules and march orders. The machine hadn't broken down. It was available for another engagement. Rennenkampf knew what had happened to Samsonov. He couldn't not know. The sound of the encirclement battles had been audible across a significant distance, and the prisoner columns moving west through East Prussian towns were visible evidence of a catastrophe. He also knew, or should have known, that the German force now turning toward him was the same force that had destroyed his colleague's army, augmented by the two transferred corps from the Western Front that had arrived too late for Tannenberg, but were now available for the Masurian Lakes campaign. He had learned something from Gumbinnen that he hadn't fully acted on. He had learned something from Samsonov's fate that he intended to act on completely. When the German flanking movement developed against his southern wing on the 7th of September, Rennenkampf retreated. Not the fighting withdrawal of a force that didn't understand its danger, a rapid general retreat, coordinated and deliberate, designed to get his army back across the Russian frontier before the encirclement that had killed Samsonov's force could close around his own. The Germans got him partially. Russian casualties in the First Masurian Lakes battle, approximately the 7th to 14th of September 1914, were roughly 125,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with significant artillery losses. These numbers are large enough to constitute a major defeat in any conventional accounting. They aren't Tannenberg. Rennenkampf's army survived as an operational formation. It was damaged, expelled from East Prussia, thrown back to the Russian frontier, but it existed. The Eighth Army template, the lateral railway movement, the flanking encirclement, the reliance on intercepted communications, worked again, but only partially. Rennenkampf moved faster than the encirclement could close. He moved faster precisely because he knew what happened when you didn't. The Lodz campaign of November 1914 is a necessary counterpoint to the Tannenberg-Masurian Lakes sequence, because it demonstrates the limits of the German operational method when the conditions that had made Tannenberg possible were absent. In November, near the Polish industrial city of Lodz, German and Russian forces engaged in a massive, confused, multi-corps battle that at one point produced an almost symmetrical reversal of the Tannenberg situation. A German corps, roughly 25 corps, found itself nearly encircled by Russian forces pressing from multiple directions. The corps escaped. The battle ended inconclusively. But the near encirclement of a German formation by Russian forces, only 2.5 months after Tannenberg, is a data point that the clean narrative of German operational supremacy tends to absorb too quickly. The Russian army was learning, imperfectly, under fire, at enormous cost, but learning. The specific type of operational overextension that had destroyed Samsonov's army, 5 corps spread over 60 miles, flanks unsecured, communications broken, was being identified in Russian after-action analysis and gradually corrected in subsequent operational planning. The nail statue phenomenon that began in September 1914 belongs in this chapter because it was happening simultaneously with the military campaigns and was transforming their meaning in the German domestic imagination. Wooden statues of Hindenburg, life-sized, some larger, were erected in public squares in Berlin, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and dozens of smaller German cities. Citizens paid to hammer iron nails into the wood, the proceeds going to the war effort. By 1916, several million nails had been driven into Hindenburg's image across Germany. The ritual combined civic fundraising, patriotic participation, and something older, a folk practice of fixing a wish or a prayer to a sacred object, transferred to a secular military hero. Hindenburg's face became the most reproduced image in German visual culture, overtaking the Kaiser's. The man who had been a retired general in Hanover 3 months earlier, packing a single bag, was now the embodiment of German military virtue for an entire nation. The mythological inflation was visible in real time, and nobody, not Hindenburg, not Ludendorff, not the German government, did anything to moderate it. The myth was useful. The myth was allowed to grow. What the German Eighth Army was not given, after Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes, was the reinforcements that Hindenburg and Ludendorff requested to exploit the Eastern Front advantage. Every request went to OHL. Most were denied. The logic was, Western Front first. The stalemate developing in France required all available reserves, and the Eastern Front was, by German strategic doctrine, the secondary theatre. The soldiers who had just executed one of the most complete military annihilations of the modern era were left largely in place, while the strategic priority remained with an army group that was digging trenches in Belgium. This is, I think, one of the campaign's more telling ironies. The German military system had invested the most in East Prussia. It had built the railways, trained the officers, distributed the code books it should have, and produced the victory. And then it declined to reinforce success, because success had occurred in the wrong theatre. The Russian army's post-Tannenberg trajectory takes time to appreciate fully, but is, in retrospect, one of the more significant stories in First World War Eastern Front history. The disasters of August and September 1914, Tannenberg, Masurian Lakes, and the simultaneous heavy fighting in Galicia against Austria-Hungary had cost Russia somewhere in the range of 300,000 to 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in the first 6 weeks of the war. The replacement and retraining of those forces, the revision of communications doctrine, the reform of operational planning procedures, all of this was happening under the pressure of ongoing active operations, without pause for institutional reflection. The reforms were incomplete, uneven, and frequently underfunded, but they were real. By 1916, the Russian army that launched the Brusilov offensive, one of the most operationally innovative campaigns of the entire war, was a measurably different institution from the army that had marched into East Prussia in August 1914. Several of Brusilov's key subordinates were officers who had survived Tannenberg and drawn specific lessons from what they'd experienced. The catastrophe had become, at great cost, a teacher. The Eastern Front that opened with Tannenberg would continue for 4 more years, grinding, massive, periodically decisive in local terms, ultimately contributing to the collapse of 3 empires. The Russian Empire would be gone by 1917, the Austro-Hungarian Empire by 1918, the German Empire by 1918. All 3 had been present at Tannenberg. though Austria-Hungary only obliquely, fighting Russia simultaneously in Galicia, while Germany fought Russia in East Prussia. The battle that began it all, the clean 5-day annihilation that seemed to promise Germany a rapid resolution to the Eastern Front, turned out to be a prelude rather than a conclusion. The war in the East didn't end at Tannenberg. It opened there. What the survivors carried: letters, trauma, and the long walk home. There is a letter in a regional archive in Olsztyn, the city that was Allenstein when the battle was fought, in the building that was something else entirely in 1914, written by a farmer named Heinrich Bauer to his brother, sometime in late September of that year, after he had returned to his farm near the town then called Ortelsburg. The letter is not famous. It has not been translated. It sits in a folder among the personal effects of a regional collection that nobody outside specialist Polish archival research is likely to encounter. Bauer writes that his house is intact, but the cattle are gone. He found a Russian boot in his well. He doesn't know if there is a foot in it still. He hasn't looked. His wife won't go to the well. That letter is the register I want to start from, because it is the register that operational histories almost uniformly decline to use. The Battle of Tannenberg, from the perspective of the 8th Army War Diary, was a complete and successful encirclement operation. 3 to 4 pages of operational notation, clean margins, precise timestamps. From the perspective of Heinrich Bauer, it was a boot in a well and a wife who wouldn't draw water. Both accounts are true. The discipline is to hold them simultaneously. The East Prussian civilian displacement of August 1914 was, at the time, the largest single civilian population movement in German history. Approximately 870,000 German civilians fled westward before the Russian advance between the 17th and 30th of August. They moved on the same roads that German military columns were using, creating a countercurrent of refugees and soldiers that multiple contemporary accounts describe with a specific kind of exhausted bewilderment. Families with carts piled with household goods moving west, soldiers on foot or flat cars moving east, passing each other on roads too narrow for comfortable separation. Russian foraging parties in East Prussia were not, by the available evidence, conducting systematic atrocities. They were hungry soldiers in enemy territory, taking livestock and food from abandoned farms, sometimes burning buildings during exchanges of fire, occasionally shooting at civilians who shot at them from windows. German civilian accounts describe it in terms that exceed these facts, because the experience of foreign soldiers on your farm, in your village, taking your animals, is experienced as catastrophic, regardless of whether it meets any formal threshold of atrocity. The trauma was real. The specific framing of it, as racial violence, as the Slavic horde, was amplified and distorted by German nationalist press coverage that found the East Prussian refugee crisis useful for propaganda purposes. The Russian soldiers who escaped the Tannenberg encirclement on foot occupied a specific kind of historical limbo. Approximately 10,000 men made it out of the pocket or off the flanks before the ring fully closed. The ones who escaped through the forest, inside the pocket when it sealed, filtering out through gaps in the German perimeter over several days, walked roughly 40 to 80 kilometers through German-held East Prussian territory before reaching Russian lines or crossing into neutral ground. The practical mechanics of this survival were mundane and brutal simultaneously. Navigation by stars when the sky was clear, by instinct and guesswork when it wasn't. Water from streams, food from whatever the forest offered, mushrooms, berries, the occasional abandoned farmhouse with something left in a pantry. Movement at night and concealment by day, hiding in pine thickets while German cavalry patrols passed on nearby roads. Several men who survived and later wrote memoirs in the Russian émigré press in Paris or Prague or Belgrade describe the disorientation of the forest most precisely. The trees looked the same in every direction. The sounds were unreliable guides. and the only trustworthy navigation aid was the occasional distant sound of artillery, which told you approximately which direction was east. Move toward the east. Don't stop. Don't make noise. Don't drink from wells that might be contaminated by dead men. Keep moving. The German prisoners taken at Gumbinnen on the 20th of August, a detail almost never discussed in German accounts of the battle, which tend to begin their accounting of prisoner exchanges at Tannenberg, numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 men. These were soldiers of Mackenson's routed 17th Corps, taken prisoner during the Russian exploitation of the Gumbinnen victory that Rennenkampf then failed to extend. They were transported eastward into Russian-held territory, processed through facilities that Russian Red Cross records describe as chaotic rather than deliberately cruel. Because the Russian army hadn't planned for German prisoners, any more than the German army had planned for 90,000 Russian ones. Some were repatriated in prisoner exchanges before the campaign was over. Some spent the remainder of the war in Russian captivity. Their experience is documented, thinly, in Russian Red Cross records and in a handful of German repatriation testimonies that haven't attracted significant scholarly attention. They are the forgotten prisoners of Tannenberg, outnumbered on the other side by 90-1 and proportionally invisible in the historical record. The psychiatric dimension of the battle's aftermath was documented by German military medicine from autumn 1914 onward, and the documentation is more clinically precise than most popular accounts acknowledge. German military psychiatrists, working within a tradition of neurology and clinical psychology that was, in 1914, significantly more developed in Germany than in Britain or France, were seeing patients they initially categorized under terms like Kriegszittern, war trembling, or Kriegsneurose, war neurosis, from the Eastern Front within weeks of the opening campaigns. Their case notes, where they survive, describe presentations that map with striking precision onto modern clinical criteria for post-traumatic stress. Intrusive re-experiencing of specific events, hypervigilance, sleep disruption, emotional numbing, the specific inability to cease experiencing an event that one military psychiatrist named Robert Galp described as the impossibility of leaving the moment behind. The soldiers with these presentations weren't categorized as cowards or malingerers in the German military psychiatric literature of this period. They were categorized as neurologically damaged. This was, by the standards of 1914, a progressive clinical position. It didn't prevent the army from treating the condition primarily through pressure and expectation of return to duty, but the clinical recognition was real. Russian émigré medical literature from the 1920s includes case studies of Tannenberg survivors still presenting acute war neurosis symptoms in 1921, 7 years after the battle. One case history describes a former officer of the 15th Corps who, by 1921, was unable to enter a forested area without experiencing what the documenting physician called a return to the forest condition, a complete re-experiencing of the encirclement that overrode the man's awareness of his actual circumstances. He was 43 years old. He was in Paris. He was unable to walk through the Bois de Boulogne. The East Prussian forest had followed him across the continent and across 7 years, and was still there, in the branches overhead, every time he walked under trees. The German soldier's letter, written during the Ustau attack on the 27th of August, transcribed in a 1934 German war letters anthology, the soldier's name not recorded, his regiment identified only as 1st Corps, contains a sentence that I have returned to more often than almost any other document in this entire archive. He is describing going forward under Russian fire. I thought of you. I kept walking because stopping seemed worse than the shells. This is not a literary formulation. It is a physiological description of how infantry soldiers function under sustained fire. The particular state in which forward movement feels less dangerous than stillness. Not because forward movement is safer, but because the body's stress response has narrowed the options available to conscious decision-making. He isn't describing courage. He's describing something more basic than courage. He's describing the mechanics of a man keeping himself moving when the rational assessment of his situation has been temporarily suspended. He wrote it to someone he loved in a letter that was somehow preserved for 20 years and eventually published in an anthology that was itself produced in the political context of a Germany being prepared for another war. The letter survived. Whether the man did is not recorded. The landscape of the battle itself has undergone a transformation that the operational histories don't track. The villages that survived 1914 were fought over again in 1915, when Russian forces briefly re-entered East Prussia. They were fought over once more, decisively, in January and February of 1945, when the Red Army's massive Vistula-Oder offensive swept through the region in a matter of days, destroying much of what had survived the previous 30 years. The Tannenberg battlefield, which in 1919 became a national pilgrimage site for German veterans, with organized tours and published guidebooks, and memorial services at the monument under construction, is today Polish farmland near Stembach. The graves are mostly unmarked. The forests have grown back over the positions. The sand tracks that broke Samsonov's supply wagons have been replaced by Polish agricultural roads. Heinrich Bauer's farm, wherever exactly it was, is under crops, or under woods, or under something built after 1945, by people who arrived after the German population was expelled. His well, and whatever was in it, is part of a landscape that has been thoroughly redistricted by history. The Hindenburg machine, how a battle built a political career. In 1925, a German political broadsheet published an advertisement for the presidential candidacy of Paul von Hindenburg. It contained one image, a photograph of the Tannenberg Memorial under construction, its 8 concrete towers rising from the East Prussian plain, and one word, Hindenburg. No policy positions, no program, no argument about governance or economic recovery or foreign relations, just the name, and behind the name, the thing that the name had come to mean. The broadsheet's designers understood something that political communication has always known, but rarely executes this cleanly, that a name can be made to carry an entire argument if the argument has been sufficiently embedded in the culture's emotional infrastructure over the preceding decade. By 1925, Hindenburg carried the argument. The broadsheet just surfaced it. The process by which a military victory becomes a political personality cult is not mysterious, but it requires time and consistent investment. Between 1914 and 1925, the Tannenberg victory had been reproduced, amplified, and mythologized through every available medium of German cultural production. The nail statues, those wooden figures installed in public squares across Germany, into which citizens paid to hammer iron nails as war donations, had established Hindenburg's image as a participatory national symbol. You didn't just look at Hindenburg, you physically attached yourself to him, drove a nail into his wooden body, contributed money to the war through the ritual of touching him. This was crowd psychology converted into institutional fundraising, and it worked at a scale that surprised even its organizers. By 1916, several million nails had been driven into Hindenburg images across Germany. His face was more widely reproduced than the Kaiser's. His name was invoked in speeches about German identity, German resilience, German civilization. He had become, without quite meaning to, the human embodiment of a narrative about what Germany was and what it was capable of achieving. The postcards sold in the hundreds of thousands, the newspaper profiles, the illustrated magazine features, the authorized biographies that began appearing as early as 1915. All of them worked from the same template. A great commander arrives at a moment of crisis. He grasps the situation. He acts decisively. He saves East Prussia. He saves Germany. The template required a simplified Tannenberg, scrubbed of Hoffmann's actual plan, scrubbed of Francois's serial disobedience, scrubbed of the railway engineering that made everything possible, scrubbed of the Russian codebook that wasn't delivered, and the Russian supply wagons that couldn't move through sand. The simplified version was more useful than the accurate one. The simplified version had a hero. The accurate version had a system. Hindenburg's 1920 memoir, entitled simply Out of My Life in the English translation, is the most widely read primary source on Tannenberg in the Anglophone world, and one of the more consequential acts of historical construction in 20th century German letters. It presents Tannenberg as the product of decisive command judgment, of Hindenburg and Ludendorff arriving and immediately perceiving the correct operational response. Hoffmann appears in it, briefly, as a competent staff officer whose preliminary work the new commanders built upon. The 1929 German General Staff internal study, which concluded that the plan was substantially complete before the arrival of the new army commander and his chief of staff, was internal, classified, and invisible to the public. The memoir was published, promoted, and read by hundreds of thousands of people. The myth had better distribution than the correction. The 1925 German presidential election is, in retrospect, one of the more consequential democratic decisions in modern European history. Hindenburg, at 77 years old, had not sought the candidacy. He was persuaded to stand by conservative and nationalist political figures who believed, correctly as it turned out, that his name was worth more than any policy program they could construct. He won by a narrow margin, defeating the Catholic Centre Party candidate in a three-way race. The analysis of voting patterns shows clearly that he outperformed what any conventional conservative candidate could have achieved, because he was not, in the minds of his voters, a conventional conservative candidate. He was Tannenberg. He was the man who had saved East Prussia. He was the name on the broadsheet with no program, needing no program, because the image of the memorial under construction said everything that needed to be said. The dedication ceremony of the Tannenberg Memorial on the 18th of September 1927 is a moment that deserves attention not as a military commemoration, but as a political speech act. Hindenburg's address, delivered before a large crowd that included veterans, government officials, and foreign diplomatic observers, moved from memorial ceremony into foreign policy without visible transition. He rejected the war guilt clause of the Versailles Treaty. Germany did not cause this war, in terms that violated the diplomatic norms of memorial address while technically remaining within them. The Allied powers were alarmed. The German nationalist right was electrified. The Weimar Republic's government, which was attempting to pursue a foreign policy of gradual reconciliation with the Western powers, watched its own president detonate that policy from a lectern at a war memorial. The memorial had always been, beneath its commemorative function, a political instrument. On the 18th of September 1927, it performed that function explicitly. The 1932 presidential election returned Hindenburg to office with a larger mandate, in a campaign whose ugly features included the emergence of Adolf Hitler as his principal challenger. Hindenburg defeated Hitler in the second round, with approximately 53% of the vote. His campaign materials featured photographs of the Tannenberg Memorial, quotations from his war service, and imagery of a stable paternal figure standing between Germany and extremism. The campaign worked. Hindenburg won, and 7 months later, on the 30th of January 1933, he appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The historians debate about whether Hindenburg in January 1933 was a calculating political agent or a senile man being managed by his advisors, Franz von Pappen's circle, his own son Oscar, remains unresolved. The documentary evidence is genuinely mixed. What isn't in doubt is that the appointment was his to make, that he made it, and that the political authority with which he made it had been constructed over 20 years on the foundation of a battle fought in the forests of East Prussia. Hindenburg died in August 1934. Hitler presided at his funeral with the specific ceremonial intention of fusing the Weimar period's soldier president, the stable, conservative, respectable face that had made the Nazi appointment politically acceptable, with the new regime's mythology. The Tannenberg memorial burial, in its elaborate stone crypt, was the ceremony that accomplished this fusion. The man who had been made by Tannenberg was buried in the monument to Tannenberg. The monument that had been built to honor a military victory was now the sepulchre of a political legacy. The German army that had blown up the memorial in January 1945, on direct orders to prevent Soviet capture, was destroying in concrete and stone the physical architecture of that same legacy. The Wehrmacht engineers who detonated the towers were soldiers of an army that the man in the crypt had helped to put in power. The recursions of this history are, by any standard, extraordinary. The nail statues are mostly gone. A handful survive in regional museums, displayed as artifacts of wartime popular culture. The memorial is foundations in a Polish field. Hindenburg's coffin is in Marburg. The broadsheet with the single word and the single image has been digitized and is available in German digital archives. A small, clean rectangle of political genius that required almost no words to say what it meant to say. 20 years of myth construction in one advertisement. The battle that started it all lasted 5 days. The revisionist's burden, what the historians got wrong. Let me begin with a document. 1929. German General Staff Internal Study. Marked for internal circulation, not publication. The study examines the planning and execution of the Battle of Tannenberg and reaches a conclusion that, given the institutional context, required considerable professional courage to write down. The conclusion, in the measured language of staff assessment, the operational plan for the battle was substantially complete before the arrival of the new army commander and his chief of staff. This document was filed. It was not published. It was not cited by Hindenburg or Ludendorff. It sat in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv for approximately 60 years, where it was eventually found by the American historian Dennis Showalter during his research for what became the most rigorously sourced single-volume study of Tannenberg in the English language. The document contradicts its own army's founding myth. It was suppressed. The myth survived. The Hoffmann versus Hindenburg versus Ludendorff credit question is the central historiographical problem of Tannenberg, and it resists clean resolution because all three principals had compelling reasons to construct self-serving accounts, and all three did exactly that. Hoffmann's diary, his most direct primary source, kept contemporaneously, consistently and sharply attributes the operational concept to himself, describing the new commander's arrival as their adoption of a plan already in motion. His post-war memoir amplifies this, sometimes to the point of open mockery of Hindenburg's role. Ludendorff's memoir, one of the most widely read German military accounts of the war, presents himself as the operational architect who arrived, grasped the situation, and directed the battle. Hindenburg's memoir is more restrained about specific operational claims, but builds an overall narrative of decisive command that rests entirely on the Tannenberg success. 3 memoirs, 3 different stories. All 3 authors professionally and personally invested in a specific version of events. What the evidence supports, when you work through it carefully, is a more complicated picture than any of the 3 accounts provides. Hoffmann had the operational concept before Hindenburg and Ludendorff arrived. The lateral rail movement, the encirclement template, the calculated gamble on Rennenkampf's passivity. This is supported by the 1929 staff study, by the timestamps on the preliminary movement orders, and by the testimony of surviving 8th Army staff officers who were present during the transition. But Hoffmann was not the army commander. He couldn't authorize the full operational commitment that the plan required. He needed someone who could. The decision to strip the screen against Rennenkampf to a cavalry force and concentrate everything against Samsonov. Accepting the risk that Rennenkampf might turn south and hit the German rear was a command decision of the kind that required seniority, authority, and nerve that Hoffmann, as operations officer, couldn't provide. Ludendorff provided the nerve. Hindenburg provided the authority. The plan was Hoffmann's. The execution required all three. The Rennenkampf-Samsonov personal enmity story is cleaner to resolve because the evidence against it is specific rather than interpretive. Hoffmann claimed, in his post-war memoir and in conversations with journalists during the 1920s, that he had personally witnessed a physical altercation between Rennenkampf and Samsonov on a railway platform during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905. That this fight was common knowledge in Russian military circles, and that his awareness of their mutual hatred had shaped his confidence that Rennenkampf would not march to Samsonov's aid. The story is vivid, psychologically compelling, and endlessly repeated. The scholar David Schimmelpenninck van der Oy, in work published in the 1990s, examined every available Russian, Japanese, German, and contemporaneous source from the Russo-Japanese War period, and found no corroboration for the platform brawl from any witness other than Hoffmann. Not a single independent mention. The story appears for the first time in Hoffmann's post-war account, under conditions where it served his professional reputation perfectly. The most charitable interpretation is that Hoffmann was misremembering or conflating separate incidents. The less charitable interpretation is that he invented it. The story is almost certainly false, and it has been repeated in virtually every popular account of Tannenberg written in the past 100 years. The prisoner number discrepancy is a smaller problem, but a revealing one. Hindenburg's memoir gives 92,000 Russian prisoners. The contemporaneous German 8th Army operational records, documents produced during and immediately after the battle, before anyone was thinking about memoir writing or legacy management, give a figure closer to 70,000, with the higher numbers representing prisoners collected over the subsequent days of mopping up operations and the early stages of the Masurian Lakes campaign, rather than the Tannenberg encirclement specifically. The difference between 70,000 and 92,000 isn't operationally significant. The victory was complete at either figure, but it is historiographically significant. The 92,000 figure in Hindenburg's memoir is the number that appears in virtually every popular account, every documentary, every school textbook treatment of the battle. It is a memoir number, not an operational record number. Every time it's repeated without qualification, a piece of myth is being passed off as a data point. The Marne Corps transfer debate has been covered in the previous chapter, but its historiographical dimension belongs here. The German nationalist interpretation that the Corps transfer decided the Marne, that Moltke's panic robbed Germany of victory in the West, was constructed partly for political purposes in the interwar period, as part of the broader stab-in-the-back mythology. If Germany had won the Marne but for the cowardly panic of Moltke and the Eastern Front crisis, then the German defeat of 1918 was a political failure, not a military one. The Corps transfer became evidence in a case that was being argued, for reasons that had nothing to do with honest operational analysis. More recent scholarship, including Terence Zuber's revisionist work on the Schlieffen Plan, however contested his broader arguments are, has demonstrated that the German Western campaign had structural problems that preceded and were independent of the Corps transfer. Moltke's modifications to the original Schlieffen Plan template, the understrength right wing even before the transfers, the command coordination failures between First and Second Armies, these were real and independently damaging. The Corps transfer was a contributing factor. It was not the sole or necessarily primary cause of German failure at the Marne. The Samsonov question is, for me, the most important historiographical rehabilitation in this entire story. The popular narrative, the hapless Russian general, outclassed, outmaneuvered, stumbling into a trap, is contradicted by his own documented record during the campaign. Samsonov argued against the mobilization timeline. He argued for rest halts. He argued against the axis of advance. He reported logistical collapse accurately and was overruled at every point. His operational errors were real. The continued advance of his center on the 26th and 27th of August drove his best formations deeper into the encirclement, when a halt might have offered some possibility of retreat. These errors existed within a constraint framework imposed by Zhilinsky and by the alliance obligations that Samsonov did not design and could not override. Treating him as primarily responsible for the disaster requires ignoring the documented record of his communications with Zhilinsky, requires dismissing his specific, accurate logistical reports as evidence of incompetence rather than honest assessment, and requires placing the operational blame on the man who argued most clearly that the operation was unsustainable. The honest assessment is that Samsonov was a competent commander placed in an impossible situation by superior officers who refused to acknowledge the gap between their operational intentions and the logistical reality their army was actually living. What the popular Tannenberg narrative needs, and mostly hasn't received, is the same treatment that Dennis Showalter's 1991 archival study gave it: a systematic comparison of memoir evidence against operational record evidence, with explicit acknowledgement of the incentive structures that shaped each source. Showalter's book is out of print in most markets. It is essentially unknown to the podcast and video audience that currently consumes First World War history in significant numbers. The Hindenburg memoir remains widely available. The Hoffman myth of the railway platform brawl circulates freely. The 92,000 figure repeats without qualification across platforms that collectively reach millions of listeners and viewers per month. The myth has better distribution than the correction. It always has had. This doesn't make the correction less important. It makes it more urgent. The field at Tannenberg. What remains there is a Polish National Heritage Board survey of the Tannenberg site, completed in 2009, that describes what remains of the Tannenberg Memorial with the flat, bureaucratic precision of archaeological documentation. Visible remains consist primarily of foundation courses of the former memorial perimeter wall, several concrete anchor points for flagpole bases, and disturbed subsurface stratigraphy consistent with wartime interment sites. No commemorative infrastructure is currently maintained. This is the last primary source in this series, a heritage survey describing concrete foundations in a Polish field. The most consequential battle name in Weimar German political history has come to this: foundation courses and anchor points and disturbed earth. The memorial's destruction in January 1945 was simultaneous with the destruction of the political world it had been built to commemorate. The Red Army's Vistula Oder offensive, launched on the 12th of January 1945, the largest Soviet offensive operation of the entire Second World War, crossed the East Prussian frontier with a speed and force that gave German civilian populations roughly 48 to 72 hours of warning before the advancing columns arrived. The German army engineers who detonated the Tannenberg Memorial's 8 towers on the 21st of January 1945 were working against the clock of an advancing front that was roughly 2 days away. Hindenburg's coffin was removed before the charges were set, loaded onto a vehicle, taken westward through the chaos of a disintegrating front, beginning a journey that would eventually end in the Protestant garrison church at Marburg, where it remains today. The stone and concrete that had taken 3 years to build and had been dedicated with speeches about eternal German memory fell in a morning. The towers came down. The courtyard collapsed. What had been a national monument became rubble. The landscape received the rubble as landscapes receive almost everything. Eventually, and without ceremony. The East Prussian German population that had made pilgrimages to the memorial through the 1920s and 30s was expelled from the region in 1945 and 46. the largest forced population transfer in European history to that point, affecting roughly 12 million ethnic Germans from territories absorbed by Poland and the Soviet Union after the war. The villages of the former East Prussia were repopulated by Poles, many of them themselves displaced from territories in what is now Ukraine that were absorbed by the Soviet Union. The place names were changed. Allenstein became Olsztyn, Neidenberg became Nidzica, Ortelsburg became Szczytno, Tannenberg became Stembach, the name reverting to an older Polish Masurian toponym that predated the German settlement of the region. The linguistic redistribution of the landscape was total, and from the Polish perspective, historically justified. The territory had been contested between German and Slavic populations for centuries. The outcome of 1945 settled the contest by the method of total displacement. The village of Tannenberg, Stembach, has a population today of a few hundred people. It is an agricultural community. The largest employer in the wider district is an agricultural cooperative. The fields around it produce wheat, rye, and rapeseed. In August, the rapeseed is in flower, and the yellow fields run up to the edge of the pine forests that still cover significant portions of the terrain. Below those fields, somewhere in the subsurface stratigraphy that the Heritage Survey notes as disturbed, there are men, German soldiers from the 8th Army, Russian soldiers from the 2nd Army. The Heritage Survey estimates that systematic ground-penetrating radar surveys of known engagement sites in the district have identified subsurface anomalies consistent with mass burial locations. No recovery program currently exists. The soldiers are still there, under the rapeseed, under the wheat, under the concrete foundations of a monument that was built to mythologize their deaths and was then destroyed when the myth became inconvenient. The two monuments at nearby Grunwald, Stembach, tell, together, the complete story of how a landscape accumulates historical argument. Approximately 15 kilometers to the west of the former Tannenberg Memorial Site, at the actual battlefield of the 1410 engagement, there is a Polish national monument to the Battle of Grunwald. It is large, maintained, prominently signed. It is a functioning historical site where Polish and Lithuanian schoolchildren come on educational visits. The battle it commemorates, the Polish-Lithuanian destruction of the Teutonic Knights, is interpreted as a founding moment of Polish national identity and a defeat of German expansionism. The battle that was fought approximately 30 kilometers to the east, the 1914 battle that Hindenburg named after this same historical event in order to claim its symbolic power, has no major memorial. The attempt to appropriate the memory of 1410 for the purposes of a German nationalist narrative died with the monument that was built to make the appropriation concrete. 30,000 Russian soldiers died in the battle and its immediate aftermath. The majority are in unmarked graves. There is no major Russian memorial in the region. Soviet historiography suppressed Tannenberg as a subject, and post-Soviet Russian commemoration has not yet produced the kind of sustained investment in Eastern Front First World War sites that the scale of the losses would seem to warrant. The men of the 15th Corps who died in the Grunflies forest, the men who drowned in Bossau Lake, the soldiers of the Nevsky Regiment who charged German machine gun positions 5 times in the dark, they are present in the landscape in the specific, permanent way that the dead are present in places where they died and were buried and were never moved. The Heritage Survey notes the disturbed subsurface. The rapeseed grows above it. I haven't been to Stembach. I've written it as a destination throughout this project, a place I'd get to when the research was done. The research is never entirely done. I keep finding one more archive, one more émigré memoir, one more internal staff study that changes the angle of something I thought I understood. The field at Stembach would be the place where the documents end and the grass begins, where the railway schedules and the intercept logs and the codebook that wasn't delivered and the French treaty that started everything finally give way to a specific patch of East Prussian ground. I think that transition from document to landscape, from paper to earth, is one that historians need to make and tend to postpone. The postponing is not entirely dishonest. There's something in the documents that the field can't give back. But there's something in the field that no document contains. The battle lasted 5 days. It destroyed an army of between 123,000 and 180,000 men, depending on which set of records you consult, and the gap between those numbers is itself a lesson about the difference between operational records and memoir evidence. It produced 92,000 prisoners, or 70,000, depending on which source you trust. It made a retired general into a national hero who would, 20 years later, sign the documents that put Adolf Hitler in power. It gave a name to a battlefield 30 kilometers from where the battle was actually fought. And that name became the most politically loaded 2 words in Weimar Germany. It transferred 2 corps from France to East Prussia, too late for the battle they were sent to support. And those corps were absent from the Marne in September, when their absence may, or may not, the historians still argue, have tipped the balance of a battle that the Germans lost by the narrowest of margins. A boot in a well, a missing codebook, a railway timetable, a French treaty clause with its underline removed, a retired general packing a single bag, an unencrypted radio message broadcast into the August air of East Prussia, and received, transcribed, and translated by a German signals operator who happened to speak Russian. History at this scale, the destruction of an entire army in 5 days, the political consequences that ran for 20 years afterward, is always, underneath the strategic analysis, a series of specific objects and specific moments and specific people making specific decisions, most of them invisible in the official record, most of them unknown to the people making them. The boot in Heinrich Bauer's well was in the water before anyone had decided to call the battle Tannenberg. The man who left it there, whoever he was probably already dead. That is where this story ends. Not with a verdict, not with a lesson neatly extracted and packaged for modern application. With a field in Poland, a heritage survey describing disturbed earth, and the knowledge that somewhere below the rapeseed and the wheat, in the subsurface stratigraphy of a former East Prussian agricultural district, the soldiers are still there. They have been there for over 100 years. Nobody has gone to look.